Hello, everyone. My name is Kay Dervishi. I'm a staff reporter with New York Nonprofit Media, and I'll be emceeing today's event, Nonprofit OpCon. This is the first virtual version of our 6th annual conference, but the second day of second round of panels, as we had our first installment of the event yesterday, and we look forward to sharing all types of information related to streamlining processes and operations for your nonprofit organizations. I'd like to start out by thanking our sponsors, Cushman & Wakefield, the Parkside Group, Paymerang, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide, Nonprofit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting, Your Part-Time Controller, NFP Advisors, and St. Joseph's College, New York. For those of our audience members who are joining us through Zoom, there are a few functions I'd like to point out to you guys to use. Each of our panels will have time allotted towards the end to ask questions, and if you're interested in submitting any questions, you can do so through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to upvote any questions you might find interesting in that Q&A section. If you're interested in just sharing general comments with other webinar attendees, you can do that through the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your screen. Please just make sure to use the drop-down box to share comments with all attendees and not just the panelists. You can also feel free to change the view settings in Zoom in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And just as a note, after the panel runs in the Q&A section, I might have to interrupt panelists just to make sure that everything stays on time. So don't be startled if I'm jumping in towards the end of it. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first panel, Plan Administrators' Fiduciary Responsibilities. And the panelists speaking in this first panel are Mark Rubenstein, President/Investment Advisor Representative at Incline Pension Consulting, Chris Kriorian, Regional Director at Pentagra Retirement Services, and Chuck Rolfe, Director of the Advanced Consulting Group at Nationwide. And with that, you all can take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today. We appreciate your time. Basically, folks, our goal today is to educate all of you of your fiduciary responsibilities as a plan administrator of a retirement plan, whether we're in the middle of a pandemic or not. That's extremely important. Next slide, please. When it comes to fiduciary responsibilities and administering a retirement plan, there's 7 items I'm going to touch on right now. First of all, it's important that you administrate your retirement plan based upon your plan documents. You also need to act on what's in the best interest for your participants. You need to carry out fiduciary duties, what's called prudently. You need to follow your plan documents, diversify plan investments, pay reasonable plan expenses, select and monitor and service for the plan. Now, I've summarized these. And if we go on to the next screen, we're going to get into some actual details. I'm going to break them into 2 key categories. The administration, which Chris, my associate, will spend more time on in a little bit, and the investments, which is where I want to spend some time. Many folks rely on the record keepers when it comes to the investments. You can go on to the next screen, that's fine. As I said, many people rely on the record keepers and they create a fund lineup and they rely on them to pick it. But reality, folks, is there's 3 options out there. You can either have it done yourself, or you can outsource it with a co-fiduciary or outsource it completely. The next screen, please. All right, when it comes to doing it yourself, when you have your investments, there are certain key items you need to be aware of if you're doing it yourself. First of all, you have to have an investment policy statement. That is required. You need to monitor the funds minimum of a quarterly basis. What do I mean by monitor? You got to make sure that your staff is getting top performing funds. You need to look at the fees of the funds. You need to do this at least on a quarterly basis. And you have to have notes in case you're audited. You could be audited by the Department of Labor. You can be audited by the IRS. If you don't have the resources or you don't have the expertise to be picking funds, there are two other options out there in the industry. One is known as 321. As a 321, basically it operates as what's called co-fiduciary. So you may engage, and it could be someone like myself, it could be an outside investment manager, but ultimately you still as the employer get final say as to which funds are offered to staff. Your co-fiduciary could make recommendations. Your co-fiduciary could give you a sample fund lineup. But ultimately, you are still on the hook in terms of the investments, which is key when employees really don't know what they're investing in as to what you're picking. Now, if you're like many folks who do not have investment expertise and you want to offload this completely, you can do so in what's called an investment 338. When you have a 338, which is actually an IRS code, you've now offloaded the investments to a third entity completely. What that ultimately means is you do not get choice in terms of the investments. They will create the lineup for you. They will hire and fire the funds for you. They will provide you with an investment policy statement. So you are off the hook. You get to sleep at night and not have to monitor the funds or meet quarterly. They will do it all for you. Go on to the next screen, please. I'm going to turn it over to Chris, my associate, and he's going to spend some time with the operational components of a retirement plan and your fiduciary responsibilities that come along with that.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Mark talked about the investment side. So if you remember in that slide that he had up there, there are two categories of fiduciary liability. So you have the investment side that Mark talked about, and you also have the administration side. And many of you now, a majority of plans have investment fiduciaries, like Mark said, a 321 or a 338 fiduciary, and there'll be a quiz after and all these numbers that are out there. But we want to talk a little bit about outsourcing your administrative liabilities. So there are certainly some steep fines, lawsuits on the investment side, but most of the fees, fines, and corrections come from the administration side. And a lot of people, when talking about administrative liability, a lot of folks think that their record keeper or TPA is just handling all of these chores that you see in front of you. But in actuality, you are responsible 100% for these things. And the two questions I ask about this slide, it's a popular slide that I go over with companies, are one, do you feel confident that you're doing all these separate types of chores? So there are 50 separate types of chores that you are responsible for in the 100+ page plan document for the plan. And the term plan administrator is mentioned over 250 times in the average plan document, but those can all boil down to these 50 unique chores. And so when I ask that question, do you feel confident that you're doing all these and doing them all correctly? I usually get a chuckle out of people. I've had one person say, I don't know what the heck a SAR or an SMM is. And I say, well, that's not good because those are required notices that actually need to go out. But even the best teams out there, the best HR groups aren't doing absolutely everything correctly. And so don't feel too bad about that. The second question I ask people is there any reason why you would want to have the liability of administering your plan? Do you want your name to be on the 5500? Or is that something that you want to outsource? And before you completely panic about all that needs to be done about a 403B plan, I will go over in the next slide. But before I go there, on the next slide, I'll talk about how you actually have the abilities through what we call 316 fiduciary administrative outsourcing to, just like you can on the investment side, give those responsibilities off to a professional plan administrator. And before I move on, Chuck, who was introduced at the beginning, who's an ERISA attorney with Nationwide. Chuck, Mark and I talk liability, but can we get your more official guidance on, what does that mean personally for the folks that are on this call, the fiduciaries of their plans?
Sure, Chris and Mark, thank you. I just like to offer everybody a little context to all this. We deal with this, the three of us deal with this on a daily basis. So maybe for those of you who don't, let's look at it. There's two main laws that affect retirement plans. One is the Internal Revenue Code, and that's what gives the plan. So like on the left-hand column here, you see IRC Section 72P Loan Administration. That refers to the Internal Revenue Code, and obviously that's overseen by the IRS. Then the other statute that applies to these plans is ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and that's administered by the Department of Labor, and that's where we get our fiduciary responsibility guidelines. And so, Chris, in answer to your question, you said you and Mark have been talking a lot about fiduciary liability and things like that. Well, the first thing you need to know if you're a plan sponsor or an employee who works for a plan sponsor, you need to be able to figure out whether in fact you are a fiduciary under ERISA. And basically it boils down to having discretionary control over the management or the operation of the plan or the administration of the plan or its investments. And there's also another fiduciary, that would be somebody like Mark, who might be providing investment advice regarding plan assets. So none of you at the plan sponsor level are going to be providing investment advice. That's for outside professionals. But so having said that, so if you have any discretionary responsibility, and that's what we mean by ERISA Section 316, that defines plan administrator. That's the person that has responsibility legally over the administration of the plan. Or if you're a trustee, if you have a 401k plan with a trust and you're the trustee, you have legal responsibility for those assets. So that's a way that you could do it. Then also, as Mark alluded, if you're involved in picking the investments, that makes you a person that has control over the management of the assets of the plan. So basically it boils down to, do you have discretion over, if you're choosing the investment lineup, that makes you a fiduciary over the investments. If you're signing the 5500, you're a fiduciary for administration purposes. So, Chris, to answer your question directly, ERISA Section 409A states that, I'm just going to read it right here, a person who is a fiduciary with respect to a plan who breaches any of the responsibilities, obligations, or duties imposed upon fiduciaries shall be personally liable to make good any losses to the plan resulting from the breach. So that's a big thing to know, and I think that's where Mark and Chris can help you, is if you don't want to assume that liability, you can outsource it through the avenues they would provide to you.
Chuck, on the phone, we have a lot of folks who work for non-for-profit organizations. They're HR directors, perhaps executive directors and CFOs, controllers. You referenced something and went over very quickly, and I want to just kind of emphasize it for a moment, because there may be many people on the phone who actually sign the 5500. So if you're unsure as to whether you're a fiduciary or not, would you agree with me that if you're signing the 5500, you are personally liable for the retirement plan that is offered to staff?
I would agree with that.
And then, folks, I'll take it a step further, because we keep referring to personal liability. So if something here that we're going over today is not administrated properly, can a regulator, the Department of Labor, come in and fine the organization, and if the organization decides not to pay the fine, can they actually tap into the participant's account, the person who's signing the 5500, to pay the regulators? Have you ever seen something like that done or heard?
Generally, no, but it's possible. So if the person signing the 5500 did something of a personal nature, such as you've seen this occasionally from time to time, somebody that's in a position of authority with respect to the plan might steal money. So if you're stealing money, then obviously that's something they can tap into your account to repay to the plan. But if it's a situation where, you know, let's say there's a liability under ERISA for failing to file a 5500 timely. So if it's just, let's say they give you a $50,000 fine, typically they would get a judgment against you in court and seek assets other than your retirement plan to pay for that. But if you're bankrupt or whatever, then they could go after your plan assets as well.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, Alexis, if you could turn to the next slide. Okay, so we talked about some of the liability you have. Now I want to give you some breathing room. You know, going over this just to say that, yes, there is liability, but again, you don't have to bear the liability. And this table on the left shows some of those chores that we mentioned in the last slide. But on the right, you can outsource nearly all of your administrative liability. So those 50 chores go down to only 3. So what sounds better, 50 chores or 3 chores? So, you know, fear not, you are able to outsource this and not have a heart attack over everything that we just talked about. This particular chart shows the extent, the heaviest of the 316 fiduciary outsourcing. There's different levels. In my field of business, there are what we call light and heavy 316s. Light might provide a handful of very helpful administrative services, and there are heavies that will sign the 5500 and document. But this is the extent of what you can actually outsource. And so the only 3 things really remaining if you bring on administrative fiduciary are submitting accurate census information like hire and fire dates, depositing participant contributions timely, and working with your advisor to monitor service providers. And really, just about all workload and liability can be outsourced, even these 3. So as a helpful tip, you can work with your payroll provider to automatically transfer that census information to your record keeper. And, you know, good professional administrators, 316s, TPAs will help you to monitor the timeliness of contributions as well. And I'm sure your advisor is also helping you with the 3rd bullet point of monitoring service providers, like preparing fee analysis and benchmark reports every couple of years. So I did want to give you some breathing room that, you know, if you have the right professionals and have researched that, you know, you don't have to be as concerned about all the different things that we're talking about. But Alexis, if you go to the next slide, what are the types of corrections that we see? I get asked, you know, what are most common? And this is the IRS's top 10 list of corrections. And I'll just point out a couple. We see a lot of questions around number 1, particularly now, failure to amend for tax law changes. So I'm sure all of you by now are familiar with the CARES Act that came out a couple of months ago to enact some COVID relief. And particularly now with amendments, we're getting so many questions on when does my plan actually need to be amended to comply with these law changes. And we're getting a lot of questions on who, you know, does this person actually qualify for a coronavirus related distribution or loan? Second one we see come up far too often is incorrect definition of compensation. And that one, in terms of nonprofit plans, applies really to you that make employer contributions and have an ACP test. But a astonishing figure is that in 24 of the first 25 plans that you know, we did testing for, we found errors with the compensation, whether not all compensation was transferred over during conversion or just wrong compensation buckets were used. And, you know, the good news is we're able to correct it, rerun it, a lot of time prevent HCEs, highly compensated employees, from getting contributions. But we see incorrect compensation a lot. And I'll jump down to number 5, lastly, impermissible in-service withdrawals as a common issue. So when someone comes to you and they say, my mortgage was due on the 15th, I just got a late fee, a late notice, I want to take a hardship withdrawal, do you know whether that would qualify for a hardship withdrawal? Or, you know, is a late notice okay? Or would you actually need something like an eviction notice? And are you retaining records of all this stuff in the event of an audit? So these are the type of things that trip people up. And again, so things for you to be aware of, and also knowing that they're items that can be outsourced with administrative fiduciary. Chuck, anything more you'd like to add to this list of corrections that you see out there?
Yeah, I would, Chris, thank you. And I think this is a perfect opportunity to help make the distinction in our audience, in your minds, as between the role of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Department of Labor, the DOL. So as the title of this slide indicates, this is the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. And these kinds of corrections are the kind that would, if they're not made, would lead to a disqualification of the plan, meaning the plan would lose its tax-exempt status. The investments inside the plan would become taxable to the participants, you know, before they're withdrawn. So, and these kind of penalties here are typically imposed on the plan sponsor. And like number 1, for example, failure to amend the plan for tax law changes, that's a responsibility of the sponsor of the plan, and it's not really a fiduciary breach. So that would typically, when you get to the IRS level, it's a little bit different type of enforcement than the Department of Labor. The IRS is going to hand you a fine. It's going to have to be paid typically by the plan sponsor. But the overarching point, I think, to supplement what Chris was saying, is it's important for a plan sponsor to have the right group of service providers available. And I used to, in my career for a period of time, for 8 years, I was the general counsel of an actuarial and employee benefits consulting firm. And so I actually wrote the contracts that we had with our clients. And one of the things we put in the contract was that our firm, if it turned out to be our mistake, we would bear any penalty. We would bear the cost of any penalty. So let's say it's something that under our service contract, it was our responsibility to get that plan amended for tax law changes, and we didn't do it. And the IRS imposed a penalty. They're not going to impose the IRS is not going to impose the penalty directly on the consulting firm. They're going to impose it on the plan sponsor. But our contract with our client said that if it's our fault, we would remediate it. We would make it good. And I think if you're a plan sponsor out there, you need to have good advice, like the kind you're going to get from Mark and Chris, in terms of how to select a service provider. But that's one of the things you want to look for, is that service provider is going to hold you harmless, because you're an innocent plan sponsor. You're relying on these outside professionals to do these things for you. So that's my main thought there. Chris, do you have anything specific you were looking for?
No, that actually is a good segue to the next slide. You know, we're talking about actual language and you know, what can be outsourced, what type of language do you want to have in your contracts? And I get asked the question often, can you actually outsource your administrative liability, the plan administrator role? So I thought it'd be really helpful for you to see the actual ERISA code and just read it real quickly. The term administrator means the person specifically so designated by the terms of the instrument under which the plan is operated, or to paraphrase, if you don't designate one, you, the plan sponsor, are take on this role. And I pointed out the word designated. So you can say, in terms of the operation of the plan, this plan document, I didn't go to school for this. I would rather give this to a professional that does it. So you do have the ability to so designate someone to do the administration for you. And effectively what that means is you get to cross your name off of the plan document, cross your name off of the 5500. So what we call the 316 fiduciary, all these acronyms, the administrative fiduciary becomes the 402A named fiduciary in the plan document, and the capital P, capital A plan administrator in the 5500, replacing you. And I guess the power of that is, we've had cases where the IRS doesn't call, or DOL doesn't call you, IRS doesn't call you. They end up calling the administrative fiduciary that you assign to the plan. So there is certainly valid relief that's available. And Chuck, just before I conclude my piece, what I see is it's so essential to work with your advisor or to go through the actual service agreement itself, because the service agreement is the legal language. And again, there are different levels that I talked about, light and heavy. The devil really is in the details. How important is it to look at the legal language, to look at the actual service agreement before you bring anything on?
So it's absolutely critical, because the role of the plan sponsor, what I'd like to point out to the audience here is this is an exact definition out of ERISA. And what it indicates to me is that the plan sponsor actually has two different roles. It has a non-fiduciary role. So when you get together with your board of your nonprofit organization and you decide at a board meeting to either establish a 403B plan or a 401k plan, that is not a fiduciary action. That's what we refer to as the settlor, SETTLOR function of the plan sponsor. So that would be one example. Another example of a settlor function of the plan sponsor would be deciding, in a case of a 401k plan, what the vesting schedule is going to be or how the match is going to work. Those are all non-fiduciary decisions of the plan sponsor. But I think what Chris is getting to on this slide is that unless the plan sponsor offloads that fiduciary responsibility to an outside party, it then has a fiduciary role to play in the plan. So the administration of the plan itself. So Chris's specific question was, what do I think about the contract? They're always under ERISA, there has to be a written service agreement between the service provider, that's what the DOL calls somebody who's providing services to the plan, and the fiduciary of the plan who engages or hires that service provider. And to Chris's point, you have to read the contract language, because I've seen contracts before that simply say, I, as a service provider, I'm just going to review the work of somebody else. I'm not going to actually do it, and I'm not going to hold you responsible. So the best kind of contract you can get if you're a plan sponsor is what I refer to as an exculpatory contract, meaning that you want somebody that you're hiring to take that liability off your shoulders. That's exculpation, as opposed to just, Chris referred to it earlier, it's kind of a co-fiduciary role.
Thank you, Chuck, very much. And my final thought before I hand it over to Mark and open up to questions is 15 years ago, very few companies had an advisor that acted as in any kind of fiduciary capacity, in a 321 co-fiduciary, 338 discretionary fiduciary capacity. Most of us had brokers on their plans. Fast forward to today, and a majority of plans have an investment fiduciary on their plans. Right now, on the administrative side, we see about 5 to 10% of plans have a 316 administrative fiduciary, but it's a very fast growing trend. 6 years ago, I was the only professional administrator in the room. Now they're just about everybody, all of your providers out there offer some kind of fiduciary service. So I thought it would be really helpful today, amidst everything going on, all the fires that you're putting out, and I want you all just to take a pause for yourself, take a minute for yourself, and take some time to cover yourself and reach out to your investment advisor, reach out to your provider and say, we just want to make sure that our investment liability is outsourced, that our administrative liability is outsourced. How do I bring on an administrative and an investment fiduciary? And breathe comfortably. These are very easy things to add to a plan, cost effective. So I hope it was really helpful. These are very valid means to protect yourself. There's a lot of liability, but there's easy measures you can take to get yourself out from under the middle. And Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate everybody's time. We'll open up the chat in case anybody has any questions. I'll keep an eye on that. While I'm doing that, a couple of things I just want to add, and I want to touch on two key items. First, Chris mentioned in his presentation about eligible compensation. I want to bring up an example because I'm dealing with it with a lot of my own clients. You need to ask yourself, do you provide your employees at any point in time either a bonus or do you do a severance package? Then you got to read your plan document and find out if that compensation is included or excluded in the retirement plan and make sure you're administrating it properly. That's an error, folks, I'm finding all the time. A lot of my clients engage in Pentegra, so Pentegra pays attention to that stuff and catches it. But that's just one item to pay very close attention. He touched on hardship withdrawals. I hate to say it, but yeah, you got to be the bad cop, and you got to ask for documentation. I have a lot of folks that don't like asking their employees for that level of specific information, but you have to. And the other thing, I've been doing this for 30 years and working with the non-for-profit community. And in the 403B space, you're going to find that there has been historically a lot of insurance companies that offer you a variable annuity product where they've provided you with anywhere from 30 to I've seen as much as 60 different funds, and they say here. And then you offer that to staff, and you may think you are off the hook, but you're not. So if you are the insurance company that you're working with and they provide you with that product, ask them who is on the hook as the investment fiduciary with that annuity. Who is monitoring those funds that you're providing to staff? Where's the investment policy statement? Ask the record keeper those questions. In many cases, the record keeper will turn around and say, if you push them hard enough, that it's not them, and that's important. I don't see any questions. Anybody have any questions for any one of us?
Hi, this is Kay, just jumping in. Just a reminder for all of our attendees, our panelists will be available for the next good couple of minutes to take any questions. If you're unsure of how to submit them, Zoom has a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can just feel free to submit it through there and upvote any other questions that might be of interest. And in the meantime, I guess for our panelists, if you have any other sort of big takeaways you'd like to share, please feel free to do it now. And otherwise, as we sort of take a pause in between the time for our next panel, please feel free to use this time to take a quick break, grab a glass of water, head to the bathroom if you need to. Again, our panelists will be here for a bit if there are any other questions in the meantime. I'd also like to draw attention to a couple of other events that City and State will have coming up. We have a Digital New York event on July 23rd. The registration for that event is free and can be found on the City and State website, and that will also be linked in the chat. We also will have an Economic and Social Equity in New York virtual event on August 4th. And that would be from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m., similar time as the nonprofit OpCon today. The registration is also free for this event and is also listed on the City and State website if you're interested. In addition, please feel free to join us and our partners at Be Social Change for the Nonprofit Connector, which is a facilitated networking event today at 6 p.m. It's a great time in an online setting to continue making connections that you've made here, meet other nonprofit professionals, grow your network, and share resources and best practices to strengthen the sector. All nonprofit OpCon attendees have access to free tickets to this event when you register with the code nonprofit100. The details for that are also linked in the chat. So please feel free to join us if you're interested. I'd also like to quickly thank our sponsors, Cushman and Wakefield, the Parkside Group, Hamerang, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide, Nonprofit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting, your part-time controller, NFP Advisors, and St. Joseph's College, New York. And to our panelists, are there any other questions coming in or thoughts you all would like to share in the meantime?
Okay, I just saw the one that asked about, I think some of this can be French when we talk about ERISA code. I just asked about the slides being shared again, and if that can go out to people.
Yeah, I think we can send that in a follow-up email to all of our attendees if that's of interest to anyone. So that can definitely be arranged. And again, just you know, in the heads up for the next panel, or if anyone has any thoughts about the recent discussion we've just had, please feel free to use the chat function, which is also on the bottom corner of your screen. Just please make sure to change the settings so it sends to all panelists and attendees, so everyone can see the comments that you are sharing. And also feel free to change the view settings in the top right corner of your screen. That's also of interest. And our events team has also confirmed that we will certainly send the slides out in a follow-up email after the event. So if anyone is interested in reviewing the content that was just shared, that will be available to you after the fact, along with some other information. So much appreciated. Thank you so much to Mark, Chris, and Chuck for joining us today for today's panel. And with that, we can prepare thinking about the next panel. And if you all have any final thoughts or farewells, please feel free to share.
Thank you very much for your time, everybody. I appreciate it. And everybody stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Okay, this is Chuck, just 15 seconds. Just because the attendees are not-for-profit, do not think that the IRS and the Department of Labor will leave you alone just because you're a not-for-profit entity. They will find you if you make these kind of mistakes. So that's why it's important to have the assistance of outside professionals.
And with that, I'd like to begin, you know, before we start introducing into our second panel, again, thanking our sponsors, Cushman and Wakefield, Parkside Group, Hamerang, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide, Nonprofit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting, your part-time controller, NFP Advisors, and St. Joseph's College, New York. Our next panel is titled The Intersection of Technology and Office Space in a Post-COVID-19 Era, which is of course incredibly relevant given New York City is sort of moving through all the reopening phases now amid the pandemic. The panelists today are Thomas Dewar, Executive Director of Information Technology at Lutheran Social Services of New York, who will be moderating the discussion. Also joining in this panel are Wayne Ho, President and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council, Sylvia Orna, the Chief Operating Officer of Latino Justice, and Frank Orzo, VP and co-founder of Nonprofit Sector Strategies. Please again, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A button towards the bottom if you have any questions as the discussion continues. And with that, I will leave it to our panelists to start the discussion whenever they're ready. Much appreciated.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon. Just to get started, I'm going to talk about a little housekeeping. What we're going to do is we're going to have the save questions for the end. And we ask that as you put questions in, if you have a particular person that you want to direct the questions to, if you could please do that. And then we're going to each introduce ourselves and then we'll get started. So I'm Tom Dewar. I'm the Executive Director of IT for Lutheran Social Services of New York. We're a large nonprofit social service organization. We have about 670 employees, 23 locations, and an annual budget of $60 million. Our programs impact over 7,000 lives daily. Over the past 4 years, I reduced our average number of help desk tickets by 89%, reduced our average length of time to close a ticket by 82%, and using CQI methodology, reduced the average number of new help desk tickets submitted per week by 75.2%. I reduced our average spending by over $1,000 per month by renegotiating contracts and brought in over $580,000 in funding for network upgrades through various grants. I completely rebuilt our entire network from scratch, moving to a cloud-based services wherever possible, and moved all our files to Office 365. We started to implement Teams about 6 months ago when it first came out, and all of this allowed us to fully transition to a remote workforce at the very beginning of the lockdown in under 7 days, and helped our schools transition to remote instruction a few days later. All of this having the extra challenge of being done with a team of 3 people, including myself. Prior to being at LSSNY, I was the CIO of a larger organization for 14 years and was peer reviewer for the Council on Accreditation. I am co-chair of the Council of Family and Child Caring Agencies IT Committee, and I do nonprofit consulting. So now, if Sylvia could introduce herself.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Silvia Horna. I am the Chief Operating Officer at Latino Justice. As the name implies, we're a social justice organization. We seek to create, our mission is to create a more just society. We use the law, we challenge the law to secure transformative, equitable, and accessible justice. And we also seek to empower the Latinx community by fostering advocacy, litigation. Our work encompasses various areas of civil rights, from criminal justice, immigrant rights, economic rights, voting rights, matters of the island of Puerto Rico, leadership development, because education is a matter of economic justice. And in my role at the organization, I am responsible for implementing key areas of our strategic planning, and I lead all of the people operations strategies. As you will see from the dialogue, probably you will notice that I seek to align purpose, values, peoples, and resources to make sure that we guarantee the results that we need. Tom, back to you.
All right, thank you. Wayne, can you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wayne Ho, and I'm the president and CEO of the Chinese American Planning Council, CPC. We were founded in 1965, and we are the nation's largest Asian American social services provider. So we employ about 5,000 employees. We serve about 60,000 New Yorkers each year throughout the 5 boroughs. We do so through 50 programs in our 3 pillars. Our pillars are education, so we believe education is lifelong, so that includes early childhood to adult education. Second pillar is family support. We believe that families of all across generations should have the resources they need to thrive. So that includes our child welfare work, anti-discrimination work, and others.
I can't hear anybody.
And then
oh wait, I know what the problem is. My fault.
And then last but not least, our third pillar is community and economic empowerment. So we do workforce development as well as affordable housing. And we also do civic engagement and policy and advocacy work. So we work with everyone from 2 to 102. And I look forward to speaking more with everyone about this topic. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you. All right, Frank, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Frank Orzo. I'm co-founder of Nonprofit Sector Strategies. We help nonprofit organizations with strategic planning, and we also market a portal for boards to help become more efficient and effective called Bell's Board. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to meet with you folks today.
Okay, so I guess we'll get started. So my first question is directed at Sylvia. What are you doing to adapt your office space to return to work?
Sure. Evidently, we are following all of the guidelines that are in place by the city, but our attempt always is to be a little bit more conservative to that. Like, For example, right now, our team is entirely working still remotely. We're going to be getting back to work in a couple of weeks. So one of the things that we have done for our organization is that we have created a plan that involves a staggered return in a lower percentage than the percentage that has been put forth as the recommended one. So the recommended one is 50%, so we're going to be back at 30%. Our initial that phase one, our initial return, is basically on voluntary basis, making it available for people who actually need the resources of the organization, or they just simply desire to get back to the office. We have divided the team in groups so we can do the necessary contact tracing if possible, if we actually have to do it. We are aware that our responsibility is to create the safest work environment for our employees. So we are adapting our office in terms of changing our AC filters to the MERV13, for example, which are the ones that filter bacteria and viruses. We are making the use of masks mandatory within the office space, which we are making available for employees. We are distancing certain furniture within the office, limiting capacity within meetings. So we have a very thorough, comprehensive plan that for the physical space makes sure that people have that perceived and real sense that, that they're protected. In the meanwhile, obviously, we are working with technology in terms of sustaining our remote work, which will obviously continue for a percentage of the staff as we continue to, advance in the implementation of our return to workplace plan.
Thank you. And Wayne, what are you doing to adapt your office space for return to work?
I think it's similar to what Sylvia mentioned in terms of following guidance. I would say the main thing that we decided early was that we're not bringing anyone back to whatever the quote unquote new normal is until after Labor Day. And we wanted to make sure that we took the summer to plan our programs. What happens at a childcare program at one of our standalone buildings is very different than what happens at one of our senior centers, let alone our community centers that might have multi-generational programming coming in and out and people sharing elevators. We have residential programs at affordable housing, and we have housing for individuals with developmental disabilities. That's been a 24-hour essential service since the shelter in place. So in addition to following guidance, and doing the changes that Sylvia's already mentioned on how we're rethinking waiting rooms, how we're rethinking office space, how we're anticipating some of our classes will continue to be virtual programming. I think one thing that we've had to do is we decided to bring in and contract with some health professionals to give us some guidance there, as well as some design professionals. This is actually a recommendation that we've had for the city of New York and state of New York, is that they should actually have a team of people from the city helping all of us out as nonprofits to decide, to determine what would be best on the ground. And we're still waiting for a response on that. But I think that, like all other nonprofits, our leadership teams, our frontline program staff, we've all been meeting regularly to plan for the new normal.
Thank you. And Wayne, again for you, will you continue some form of remote work when you return?
Yeah, we are planning to do that. I think we all know that it's part of our jobs to keep our staff healthy and safe in all means, as well as keeping our community members healthy and safe. And we're talking not just about COVID-19, we're talking about the anti-Asian violence that is happening because of COVID-19. Obviously, there's a lot of protests going on right now, and rightfully so, to say Black Lives Matter and to promote racial justice. But we are planning to continue doing remote learning. We know until we find a vaccine that we can only have so many people in the classroom. We can only have so many people in the class. We can only have so many kids or young people in spaces. We're still waiting for direction from the Department of Education on how many students are going to be on site and how big can we provide our after-school programs. So we are planning to continue doing virtual programs. Our Medicaid funded services, for example, we're hoping to continue doing telehealth through those programs. For those classes that have been successful doing remote learning, we'll continue to do that. We've actually learned a lot about using video game platforms like Discord to engage young people during this time. We've done more Facebook Live to do our policy work. We've also been able, instead of bringing in 500, 600 of our full-time staff into one space to do our all-staff meetings, we found out that Zoom and Microsoft Teams have actually worked really well to cut down on travel times and have more communications. And then honestly, it's more cost effective. So we are planning to make sure that we maintain the best parts of remote learning, and we continually talk to our city and state and federal government funders to make sure they can continue to allow these program modifications.
Thank you. And Sylvia, will you continue to continue some form of remote work when you return?
Yes, we are definitely going to, particularly because our initial stage, we have a plan that actually is in 3 stages. The first stage is at the 30% capacity. So that 30% of people will only go to the office 2 days a week. So there's 2 different groups that go 2 days a week, each of them, and then the remaining of the office continues to work remotely. So we must continue with the connectivity that we have right now. The rationale behind us going back to work, or rather opening our office for those who need to go back to the office, is a matter of equity in terms of providing people with the resources that they need to do their work and to be successful. While we have, of course, legal interns and young professionals that they need to develop certain particular skill set that is only developed while you're actually, interacting with others, the soft skills that you need. So in that initial stage, we are continuing on the second stage, in which we are increasing our capacity to the 50 to 75%. There's going to still be a number of people that are going to be working remotely. So we will continue in this way for sure. This in what it pertains of us as an organization, how we're working together. But then our programmatic work is the one that, for the most part, has been converted to virtual learning, educations, webinars, etc. And it has actually been quite successful in the sense that it has expanded our ability to reach out more people that when they were in person, they were limited to the tri-state area, obviously. And although we are a national organization with offices in Florida and Texas as well, we are certainly seeing, I guess it's an interest, obviously, in the work that we do, because of the current circumstances, as Wayne noted, social justice movement that is happening right now as well. So as a matter of that, the fact that people are more often than not connected to their computers, and the visibility of organizations such as ours and the work that we do is out there more. So we are going to continue for the time being, and we will definitely see our program work turning into a hybrid of what the new norm is going to be, combined with technology and our internal operations as well.
Thank you. And also for Sylvia, I know you guys covered this a little bit already, but do you think that this crisis has permanently changed the way you will work and do business?
I hear that question quite a lot, and my initial reaction is to say it's too soon to tell, because we are still in the middle of a moment that we haven't really, we cannot consider it ended to make an assessment and see how we're moving forward. But certainly all of our organizations have tested new waters, and they have understood that there are certain duties that can certainly be done remotely, others that needed to adapt to be done remotely, and others that would require further evaluation. Overall, I think that after people feel more comfortable of returning to the workplace and people have that freedom to make that choice, is that leadership will be able to make an assessment, a full-on assessment. Okay, how can we take the lessons learned from this process, and how do we build into our organizational practices to make sure that we take the good and learn from the struggles.
Thank you, Sylvia. Just a quick housekeeping tip. If people could put their questions in the Q&A instead of the chat, that would be better. The chat tends to disappear quickly. Thank you. All right, so Wayne, do you think this crisis has permanently changed the way you will work and do business?
Yeah, I think we're on the similar page as Sylvia about, I think we're all trying to assess that. It's crazy to think that it's only been, what, 5 months, 5.5 months that we've all gone through this. I would say that I think we got to take the best lessons learned from this. We realize that there's different ways for us to engage young people during this time. There are also technologies that we were hesitant to adopt before, whether it's for fiscal reasons or because we didn't have staff to manage it. So for example, with Chinese communities, They don't use Facebook, they don't use Twitter, they like using WeChat. And we finally bit the bullet, invested in a WeChat account. We have staff members who manage it, but that's how we're getting a lot of information out to our community members right now. When unemployment was expanded, the state did not have the telephones ready to go, and we had to be able to communicate what does unemployment look like, or what does the latest stimulus package look like, or what are resources for small businesses. And we did that through WeChat, and we did that through Chinese radio. So I think we should take the best. I would also say that these learnings have to be codified, especially for those nonprofits who are contracted by the city and the state. So under a state of emergency, there were certain things that the governor's office could do to put aside certain things around contracting and procurement and moving money faster. Same thing at the city level. Instead of taking 18 to 24 months to get a contract approved, they got contracts approved and registered in 4 weeks and got money moving. So I would like to say it shouldn't take a state of emergency or a pandemic that cost 25,000 New Yorkers' lives for us to make sure that contracts can move quickly through the city of New York. Those of us as community-based organizations that provide these services, which were deemed essential, and get the resources we need to pay our staff and in order to provide services directly to the community. So I would say I think the entire sector should look at what have we learned and how we can do business differently and continue to keep people safe as we run programs.
Thank you. Also, Wayne, as you look back, and I know, again, you covered a little bit of this, what lessons did you learn during the lockdown and what you have done differently?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke a little bit about new technologies we adapted or creative things that we did around using Discord, for example, which is a video game platform to engage young people in our college access programs, or that we started investing in other technologies to do our staff meetings. And instead of trying to find expensive places to hold 300, 400, 500 staff, we were able to do that much cheaper through Zoom or Microsoft Teams. But I think that the key lessons learned is for us is really, were we as effective or could we be more effective in reaching the goals with our community members? And that means, I think we've been honest, which is we know that there's been a learning gap with in our early childhood programs and our after school programs. I'm sure all of us who are parents and we're all struggling with how to do virtual learning with the kids, and nothing can beat in-person contact and in-person relationships and positive relationships between adults and kids. But I do think that we've learned that we can work with, for example, our workforce programs differently. We had people traveling from the North Shore of Staten Island to our office in Flushing to learn hotel hospitality. We shifted that to an online program and it's worked equally well. Same thing with citizenship classes. We didn't need people coming at 9 p.m. at night from the Bronx down to Sunset Park to do a citizenship class. We were able to do that online and they could be home with their families. So I do think that there's a lot of lessons learned, but I think we also realize there's a lot of gaps. We know there's a digital divide. We know low income and immigrant communities were not getting access to tablets, that they don't have access to other resources. And I think that we have to figure out a way to balance what is most effective to reach under-resourced and underserved communities.
Thank you. Same question for Sylvia. As you look back, what lessons did you learn during the lockdown and what you have done differently?
I think one of the lessons was it pays to be forward thinking. Fortunately, our organization was ready to be working remotely for the last couple of years. We weren't necessarily prepared to say the entire workforce is going to be 100% remote. That was not the thinking behind it, but we had the ability to do it, and we needed to simply create our pandemic plan and then basically say, okay, these are the policies that supersede any other policies really in existence related to remote work or to flex work schedule, etc. So the good thing is that we were prepared for this. In terms of the programmatic work, of our programmatic work, we are a community organization. We need to be with the community. Our lawyers are known as the people's lawyers and are known for going to where the community is, for going to our clients are, because much as Wayne is mentioning, we know that that some people are not comfortable with certain type of technology, and they would rather have, our lawyers rather go to a location that they would have a group of clients and they'll have that person-to-person interaction, for example, or with all of our advocacy work, that it's about being with the community and advocating for the community and participating in community events. So those are the things that technology falls a little bit short on. Certainly we have been able to innovate and create new ways to connect with the community, but we know that there is a percentage of the community that is still out of our reach because of this. So we continue to explore alternatives and new technology that will help us to reach to that percentage as restrictions start to ease. And as I mentioned earlier, we are always being a little bit more conservative and being a little bit delayed in the implementation of whatever recommendations are out there coming from the government. But I think that that's probably, I would say that the lesson that we are still learning is the fact that there's a variety of technology that we may not be aware of that exists, that a certain group of population is using it, as Wayne just mentioned as well. And that we need to have the flexibility to look into and see how we can implement it ideally in a way that integrates properly with the current technology that we have. Or if not, then really we have enough reasons to say, although this doesn't integrate, that this is the way to do it. So that's something that we're still working on.
Thank you. And also for Sylvia, how has your board been able to meet during the lockdown, and what tools for effective board collaboration are available?
Sure. Well, our board functions like the majority of the boards, which is a group of individuals who are volunteering for the organization, and their contact with the organizations has always been in remote basis, with the exception of the quarterly meetings or the annual meetings. So much like our internal meetings, that those were turned to remote. I would say that probably there was an added challenge, but it was the same challenge that we all had. I mean, we have to recognize that they also have their full-time jobs, and they're going through the same struggles that we are individuals who are employed are going through, which is the adapting their work. And some of them may have additional complexities added to the roles that they execute. So bringing people in a timely manner was probably a challenge. So we're still devising ways in which that information can be like easily and readily accessible for our board members. Perhaps in a better way than the way that it exists right now, which is, sharing documents via email and coordinating the meetings as virtual as they might be at this point in time.
Thank you. And same question for Frank. How has the board been able to meet during the lockdown, and what tools for effective board collaboration are available? Oh, Frank, you're on mute.
How's that?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. I appreciate that. In addition to being a co-founder of Nonprofit Sector Strategies, I'm also a board chairman of Holy Cross High School in Flushing, New York. About 3 years ago, we hired a new president, and one of the first things Mr. Truesdale did was to move all the board-related information to a shared drive in the cloud. And that one act made our board's ability to subsequently meet during the lockdown easy, and it was effective. So our board members were able to review meetings, meeting information, agendas, minutes, governance documents, contact information online rather than having to rely on paper. And investing in a board portal is an effective way to improve collaboration during the lockdown and even beyond the lockdown. Board portals make it easy for board members to collaborate and to share documents, to find meeting information, what's going on with various programs or financial status, and what's upcoming events and contact information. I hear oftentimes customers will say to me, their executive director gets a call, when's the next meeting, or who's on such and such committee. So putting all this information in a portal certainly improves the collaborative capabilities of a board. Our company offers a board portal called Bell's Board, but there are several other companies that also offer these portals, these board portals. Anybody attending now, feel free to reach out to me if you want to learn more about our product, Bell's Board. So to answer your question, or to summarize, a meeting during the lockdown would not have been anywhere near as effective if we were still operating in a paper-based environment. So, and in the interest of full disclosure, Holy Cross will be transitioning to the Bell's Board portal to, among other things, improve security. Now that they went from paper to the cloud, now to a portal. So it's an ongoing process and keep getting better and more effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I know you covered some of this, but how will the board portal engage your board and keep them focused in a post-COVID environment?
So interestingly enough, the average age of a nonprofit board member as of 2012 is 68 years of age. And for the most part, as everyone on this call knows, board members typically are busy and involved people and have many other activities going on. So these board members may only engage with the board activities for which they're responsible every month or so. So it's really important that board members, given their age, given their business, given their activities, can quickly and easily get to board-related information. And that's what a board portal does. It solves that issue. Board-specific portals ensure that board members know they have one place to go to find out about their meetings, about the dates that are upcoming meetings, the governance documents, financial and program information, the status of what's going on in a particular program, and even simple things like emails and phone numbers. What's so-and-so's email address? So this one-stop shop makes all of that very easy in a post-COVID environment to improve the effectiveness of the board activity and improve engagement. A good portal should make it so easy for board members to collaborate in a common workspace without having to search through emails. We hear that all the time. We want to get away from having to look through emails to find information. And God forbid you leave someone off an email trail and they don't know about it. So this is one of the things that a board portal really addresses. It's really a step up, going from paper to electronic to a more of a one-stop shop and database. And given that more people are working remotely during this pandemic, it becomes even more important that it's easy to prepare for board meetings. So it's not just the board members who are getting the benefit, but it's the people that have to prepare for the board meetings. Two of our customers recently did a return on investment analysis, and they estimated annual savings of more than $9,000 by using Bell's Board. So that's our product, but it could be any board portal product. You just need to find something that fits your budget and has the functionality that you need.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The next question is for Sylvia. How have you seen organizations that you serve take advantage of technology to make remote operations more effective?
In our case, at least in Latino Justice, as I mentioned before, we were already prepared, and people were utilizing the technology, perhaps to a lesser degree than the technology to the degree that they are using it now. When I was a member of the board of the Organization Development Network of New York City, one of the things that we did was actually to create the entire infrastructure for the organization that was virtual. And there's certainly greater efficiency being produced when you know that that people can go to one space to find the most current information. That's one of the things that I think that right now people are looking into doing, is to make sure that they don't have like that redundancy, that having to find what was the most recent version of a document, or what was the most where are the notes of a particular meeting. They need to go to the recording meeting, etc. It's like creating this learning, these hub spaces where information relies. So in our case at Latino Justice, we're certainly maximizing the use of Office 365, which is the tool that we use. Another of the tools that we use, and we have been actually using it for about 10 years, is that we use Ring Central for our phone and video conferencing, and now we have expanded it to use for using it as instant messaging. So just having that app in our laptops is something that it has increased collaboration significantly, and the ability to just with the click of a button to say, okay, I'm meeting with somebody, in a video conference right away. So I think that overall organizations they're looking for tools that can improve communication and that can improve connectivity, visual connectivity with one another.
Thank you. Frank, same question for you. How have you seen organizations that you serve take advantage of technology to make remote operations more effective?
Well, one way to look at that is a comment that I hear often from our customers is we have a new executive director and she wants to get our board information more organized. So certainly that's just a very basic motherhood statement of let's get more organized. But oftentimes board members are not in the same physical location. So technology makes it both quick and easy for them to get to that information that they need when they need it. I recall recently hearing from an executive director at a nonprofit in New Hampshire. They implemented Bell's board, and one of the reasons she told me was she had she wanted to make it easy for a key board member in Brooklyn, New York, to access board information. And that's no matter where you are, and not only matter where you are, but when you need it. It could be 10 o'clock at night, it could be 9 o'clock in the morning. You've got one place to go to. You don't have to engage with anyone else to get the information you need. When people can get the information when they need it, their productivity definitely increases, as opposed to having to wait for someone to respond to them. It's pretty clear, I think, Thomas, that remote operations and technology go together, from what Wayne has said and Sylvia has said before me. And as all kinds of organizations shift to more remote operations, technology is a critical component to make that transition successful. In many ways, technology improves overall operations because the board members know there is one place to go to find the information they need, as opposed to sometimes needing to make a phone call or send an email or have an in-person meeting. Another example I think of is one of our nonprofit organizations has 75 advisory council members, committee members, and 75 advisory committee members. And they said it was a nightmare to keep everybody informed prior to implementing our board portal. So just imagine all those emails, and God forbid someone's left off an email trail. So it just, as I said, it goes hand in hand, technology and remote operations. And another way we've seen, another way we've seen technology improve the remote operations is by making it easier. And I heard this, I think, from Sylvia the other day when we were preparing for this meeting. It's an easier to schedule meetings. People are more available if they know they just have to have a Zoom meeting, as opposed to travel to an office or location. And scheduling becomes so much more easier if people are, as we are finding out today, very comfortable meeting Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx, whatever technology or portal your organization uses. As long as you can get to a meeting easily without having to travel, that's another way that technology is going to make remote operations more effective.
Thank you, Frank. Sylvia, you had something?
Yes, I wanted to add something, and I don't know if this is going to come up later on, but I think it's important to note that as we are talking about remote operations, one of the things that we need to always keep in mind is about data security. And this is something that probably everybody was like, okay, we need to do this, we're implementing things, or we're using Go to Your Home, but there are many different layers of data security that we need to keep in mind. And for people who are looking for technology or they're using the technology, double check who owns the data. and how the data is stored and how you can recover that data. Like one of the reasons why we are choosing the technology that we are is because we have our own we continue to keep our own private space within a particular server, even within, like, for example, RingCentral, the fact that even the instant messaging content is kept for a minimum of 7 years, which is what compliance tells you to keep certain type of information. So we don't want people to use their own personal cell phones to keep messages that are gonna, who knows when to get lost. Like, we're a law firm, so we need to make sure that we keep our client information safe and secure. And as you do that, also, you have to think about what's the training in data security that you're giving people. And also, you need to think about your cybersecurity policy. So if you don't have one, you need one. And if you do have it, then you have to review really the contents and the parameters of it to make sure that it contemplates all of the information that now is turned into virtual that maybe wasn't in the past. So I just think it's something that is very important to keep in mind, and I didn't want it to get lost.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you.
Could I comment on Sylvia's comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Frank.
Sylvia, you're right on point with that one about who owns the data. If anybody is out there contemplating looking for a technology such as a board portal, the question you should ask that vendor is, who owns the data? And a vendor should say to you, we own the application, but you own the data. And they should, another policy that you should hear from a vendor is that if for any reason you decide to part ways, how do I get my data? And the vendor should say, it's your data, we give it to you. It's whether it's an export file or a comma separated, it's your data. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Sylvia. And also to security, that portals are definitely more effective than, say, Google Drive. Google Drive is a step in the right direction, but if you really want to get to security level to fit the compliance requirements that your organization has, a portal is definitely a secure way to go.
Thank you, Frank.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I wanted to address this question a little bit too for myself. So, you know, I had mentioned that we had gotten ready for remote work in about 7 days. One of the fortunate things for me is that 4 years ago when I took over at Lutheran Social Services in New York was that we redid all of our technology from scratch in the past 4 years. And I had been a CIO during September 11th. And I remember that we had some organizations that actually lost access to their property. Fortunately, they weren't damaged, but you know, they were part of the closed off area, so they couldn't actually get to their property. And I saw that happen, and I thought to myself, I got to make sure that something like this never happens to me. I want to make sure that we don't tie our data to properties and to locations and things like that. So when I redid everything here, I tried to make everything as cloud-based as possible. So I moved all of our files to Office 365. I moved our email to hosted email with Office 365. We implemented Teams, you know, as a way to communicate. We ended up trying to move as much as possible to hosted applications so that this way, if there were cloud-based hosted applications, that was better. And we tried to do that. We're using Cisco Meraki networking gear because that is a cloud-based infrastructure and it makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot. And that's been very helpful during this lockdown. And even though we had a hosted voice over IP system, we had purchased in this new contract that just started this year, what they call soft phone licenses, which allow you to use your own cell phone as your office phone. We hadn't implemented them yet. So one of the things we did have to do during the lockdown is we had to implement those soft phone licenses really quick. And those soft phone licenses allow people to use their own cell phone as if it's their office phone. And then Teams has been very helpful as well. So I wanted to mention that. All right, so let's get back to the other questions. The next question is for Sylvia. How are you considering your organization's values to address new technology policies and procedures?
Sure, this is something that is actually quite important to us. As I mentioned before, we're a social justice organization. One of our values as an organization is that of dignity, and we believe in people's dignity and the dignity of their work. So all of the policies that we implement, we're really trying to create that alignment as to why we're creating a particular policy and how we're communicating it to the employees. So, for example, as new technology so let's talk about two different type of technologies. One is the one that as an organization we want to implement for our employees to use in the exercise of their role, and they need to understand what are the parameters under which they work. So we're talking about the content of the information, the logging in, the security, while they are at home, what type of password protected security network they have, if they're sharing it with somebody else, like all of those, basic security concerns that we need to see. But then we're talking about different type of security measures specifically related to COVID that we need to consider. And it's about personal identifiable information for people, information that might be confidential and protected under HIPAA. The fact that now some organizations may be considering taking people's temperatures, getting into the office, etc. So you have to also be very clear in communicating, like who's going to be doing that, who's going to be keeping that data, how that data is going to be kept in store, who's going to communicate to an employee, and how that record is going to be kept in terms of, okay, this person has a higher temperature, so this person needs to be sent home. So who gets informed of that, with that, what level of confidentiality that gets treated. So you may not want to do the temperature check in an area that is completely visible by everybody, that then everybody will see that somebody's turned around, for example. So those are the different type of things that you also need to consider, and you need to align your organizational values to those as well, right? So one element is compliance, but then also the other element really is what type of organization are you, to what degree you cherish your relationship with your employees, and you consider trust to be a fundamental value between the relationship between employer and employee, and how that is reflected in the policies that you execute and implement.
Thank you, Sylvia. Another question for you, Sylvia, is has this situation improved any skill sets in your organization?
I wouldn't be able to say right now if it has improved. We haven't gotten to our performance yet, but it certainly has made more visible individuals who can work better under pressure, or those who struggle a little bit more. There are people, I mean, people have very different skill sets, right? And some people prefer to work more on their own than in collaboration with others, and maybe this is an environment that is completely suitable for them, and they can excel and they can shine. So on leadership, it relies that element, and this is a different type of leadership characteristics that people need to exert if you're in that role, is that you really need a different type of leadership right now, right? You need compassionate leadership, you need transformational leadership in a way that you're able to lead people through a period of crisis, and that you're also able to lead people through a transformation, the transformation of the way that they're doing their work, the transformation of the organization, and the transformation of the workplace in general. So I think that this actually has provided an opportunity for people to showcase different type of qualities, and also to bring more visibility to individuals that probably need more support in an environment where it's more isolated, for example, or that they don't have like that person-to-person guidance and mentorship that they need, you know, like on an in-person capacity.
Thank you. I want to just address that question for myself for a quick second as well. You know, as an IT person, one of the things that has been amazing for me is our executive director had this amazing social justice committee meeting, and we had over 170 people attend on Teams from the very beginning of the meeting to the end. We even went higher than that during the meeting, but 170 people attended from the beginning of the meeting to the end. So as an IT person, seeing that, you know, for all this time I was trying to get people to use Teams, and now to see that, you know, it was able to make something like that happen where that much of an organization could actually participate in a meeting was just really cool. And I just wanted to mention that, you know, that's one of the many skills. I mean, we've certainly had our challenges, but, you know, to watch people get good at Teams and using it to communicate and stuff like that has just been really cool for me as an IT person. It really makes me happy that, you know, the technology that we work hard to put in place is actually being used and helpful.
And Thomas, you didn't have to buy donuts for 170 people.
That's true. We didn't have to buy donuts for 170 people. Yeah. So now, Wayne, has this situation improved any skill sets in your organization?
I agree with Sylvia that I think it's a little too soon, but I also agree with what you said, Thomas, that I think it's forced people to opt into technology that they wouldn't have. So I think to the theme of this workshop, it's we have a large home care program. We employ over 4,500 home care workers. We have about 55 people on the administrative side who work with the consumers as well as the workers. And the ability for them to work virtually and opt into electronic timesheets or opt into even direct deposit, telephonic check-in, check-out to consumers. And keep in mind, consumers are either homebound seniors or developmentally disabled. And for them or their family members to make sure that they are following through on technology, because it's not as easy as picking up a telephone for some populations. I think that's what's been important to see, is that people are doing things that we knew would make things more efficient and more accurate and honestly more compliant. And we've been able to see that across the board as just one example in our home care. I think the largest skill set that I'm happy about is really about just communications. With so many people working virtually, we all need to communicate more often. We need to over communicate. We need to be clear. Sending a text message with emojis or 3 words is not going to answer the question nowadays when we're trying to figure out how to reopen, or we're trying to balance a budget during crazy times where funding is getting cut left and right. So I do think that the largest skill set that we've seen amongst a very large and diverse team of folks is really around communications.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, another thing we've been using for communicating is for part of our school implementation, we got one of those messaging systems that allows you to send out broadcasts when schools are closed and things like that. And we've been using that for our entire agency as a way to message out messages as well. So it's been really helpful. You know, I've seen a lot of people talk about, you know, like, what if this had happened back when we all had flip phones and no internet, you know, and that we, you know, and in that case, you know, as horrible as this has been, we are lucky that, you know, some of the technology has been there to meet the challenges. So Wayne, our last question is for you. How do you feel this situation will transform service delivery?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think once again, until we know if there's a vaccine or not, I think that there is a new normal we need to adjust to. How I like to tear this question out is I think there's what's not going to change and what is going to change about service delivery. We know that human contact is very important. We know that there are seniors dealing with food insecurity, for example, or seniors dealing with social isolation. We can assume there's been more domestic violence during this time or more child abuse during this time. So when we talk about service delivery, what should not change? What's been declared as essential services. So affordable housing, group homes, Meals on Wheels programs that the city took over and honestly did not do well. That we need people who can cook culturally appropriate meals, know the seniors, deliver food, do wellness checks in person. I think the unfortunate truth, though, is that if you look at our senior centers, we can only have about 400 people in our senior centers, and that's where they meet their friends, get their one hot meal for the day, learn English skills. But we're not going to be able to have 400 people at a time anymore. It might be 150 or 200 due to social distancing. We know we need more PPEs. We know that we need to put up more partitions. We know we need more face masks. So we're going to have to do service delivery different. I've already touched upon how using technology and virtual classes could be helpful for some populations, but I think we need to really keep in mind what is the in-person programs that we need and how do we make sure we maximize the number of people in that space in a safe way. We did run a regional enrichment center during this time, a rec center for children of essential workers. And I think we learned a lot about digital thermometers and having a school nurse from the Department of Ed work with us and how we can feed and educate and engage and play with children during a time of COVID. And I think that once again, it's all these lessons learned that we need to do to follow through on our missions, make sure we're impactful while at the same time meeting the different, and it seems like growing needs of not only our staff, but also our clients.
Thank you. All right, so that's it for the questions we had. Now we'll go on to some of the questions for the audience, from the audience. For the first two questions I saw, one is somebody asked how big my organization is. They missed it. I had said we have about 670 employees, 23 locations, and an annual budget of about $60 million. And our programs impact about 7,000 lives daily. Another question we had, oops, hold on. Okay. So the next question is, will this, no, this isn't for anybody specifically. Will this experience in remote working change your long-term vision of physical offices and the cost of for leased space? Who'd like to take that?
I can start with it. And this is something that we've briefly also discussed before. I mean, you may, for the last 10 years, everybody was talking about the reconfiguration of the office space and how it needed to be a collaborative space, and that led to the boom of the shared co-work spaces where it was okay to sit in the desk right next to somebody because it was about the feeling of the organization versus like any concerns about privacy or anything else. So, so after organizations were somehow trying to catch up to that, so long as it was conducive, obviously, within their workplace, now we're getting to the space, the moment in which everybody has to say, wait a minute, here are the problems of an open space. Here are the problems of not having, sufficient distances between the individuals that are at the organization. So to a certain, look, I do not believe, and this is me without, necessarily pointing to a particular study in hand, but this is New York City. Somebody leaves, there's 3 people waiting to get in. So I don't see that the business space is something that is going to disappear by just simply having a remote workforce. What I do believe is that people are going to be thinking about more efficient workplaces because now people may not necessarily want to, or they won't have the need of having a bigger space to host everybody, but people are going to be getting back to shared spaces that are private to the organization. So I'm thinking that probably things are going to go in the line of certain employees working a certain number of days at home while others come to the office and share their workspaces. So you can have a larger workforce within a smaller space. Obviously this, assuming that the COVID situation is going to, eventually there's going to be a vaccine, and it's just simply going to, this is going to be the effect of people knowing that people can do a percentage of the work remote. So then why have empty offices? Well, people are a certain number of days. So I think that that's the way, probably that's where this is going to go, so long as there is some sort of containment for the COVID, because right now one of the requirements really is for not sharing any type of space or equipment, etc., to promote safety and security. So in the long term, that's what I think.
Thank you. I know for us, I've had a lot of conversations with people about this, and I know just for us, for example, we have some administrative staff who normally have a 2-hour commute to get to work, to get to our administrative office. And now that they're doing 100% of their work remotely as an organization, we're looking at that and we're saying that doesn't necessarily make any sense. And we're trying to figure out how to do things differently for the future and permanently to try and avoid that kind of thing. I know that in a similar way, other organizations that I've spoken to have mentioned recruitment of talent. That, like they narrowed their scope based on, the geographic area that they were recruiting people. But depending upon the kind of job, maybe if there's a better person that's, working in Seattle, maybe you want to hire somebody from Seattle. Why do you need to hire somebody from New York City? So, so that's people are looking at it as a way to expand their talent pool. Yeah, Sylvia?
I was to just add in the expansion of the talent pool, make sure if you are recruiting during this period of time, make sure that you have clear expectations and that you ask, can you do this work remotely? And are you able or willing to return back to the office when things go back to normal? So you need to be very clear to the degree that a particular job can be done remotely or not, or partially remote. And that if you're hiring somebody at this time, that there's clarity in terms of the expectation for that role and where that role needs to sit or not.
Thank you. Yeah, and I know one of the things we talked about in our pre-call was the challenges of managing people remotely and how that's a skill that, you know, is not easy taken. And I know I've done that myself, so I know it's tricky. The other thing is, you know, a lot of people have said that, you know, this genie is out of the bottle. A lot of companies have seen that they can do this and get away with this. You know, we've seen the way technology companies have responded. Some companies like Google and Microsoft are saying, you know, they may just continue remote work for a while. So, you know, the question comes up, you know, office space in Manhattan is very expensive. Will people use less office space, you know, because they may, you know, go to remote. So it's a possibility. Next question we have is somebody was asking for Frank. Could you please spell Bell's Portal?
Sure.
Bell's
Bells.
Portal?
Yeah. BELLES BOARD. Bell's Board. BELLES BOARD. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Next question was for me. I mentioned I chair an association's IT committee. How do you recommend people stay in touch, share information with their colleagues and other agencies when we're all social distancing, other than awesome forums like this? Well, one thing I certainly do want to mention is that, you know, being members of committees like that is very helpful. Whenever you can share information, I really recommend it. I'm on the IT committee for CAFCA, the Council of Family and Child Caring Agencies. I have been for quite a few years. I used to be on the IT committee for the Interagency Council back when we were a member. We don't have DD population anymore, so we don't do that, but they have a great IT committee. The Human Services Council has some great IT committees, and these are all great ways to communicate. And a lot of these organizations are now having remote meetings, and they're having by Teams and Zoom and other things. So it really is a great way to communicate, you know, and even like sometimes what we do is, you know, we'll just shoot each other an email when we have a question about something. Because, you know, rather than reinvent the wheels, you know, chances are if you're trying to implement something, somebody else has probably done something that you've done, you know, that you want to do. And it's always good to find out from them what the pluses and the minuses are. And if you're going to use a particular vendor, maybe hearing some people that had experience with that vendor. So it really is a really good help to be able to be a member of those organizations. And then, of course, NYN Media has had some great technology forums like this one, and they're a great way to find out about stuff as well. Next question. Again, not for anybody in particular. What are you doing about employees who have personal health risks or child care, elder care responsibilities? Are they required to work? Who'd like to take this one?
For us, I mean, the short answer is yes. We've been trying to be as accommodating as possible. So even before the shelter in place at the end of March, anybody who was afraid of working or who had health issues or other issues, we already allowed them to work remotely. I think the main issue is that we want to be a humanistic and supportive employer, while at the same time, it is our mission to serve the community. And we need individuals, whether they're programmatic or operational, to follow through. So I think we're trying to make as many accommodations as possible. I think we realize, like, with schools closed, there's people trying to teach their kids while at the same time fulfill their responsibilities. And I think we've been flexible. But that's what we're assessing right now, that we do need people to be able to work. If we need to maintain a certain amount of virtual work, or if people need more accommodations, I think we're willing to do it as long as they can fulfill their responsibilities. Obviously, someone in our fiscal department can do work at a different time than someone who has to run a class from 3 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon, for example. So we are assessing that right now. In terms of childcare, we always prioritize community members in terms of those who need childcare after school programs, but obviously we hire from the community too. So if we did have staff members who needed childcare after school programs, we always try to make those accommodations too. I think once we figure out what does after school programs and childcare look like and how many slots we have, we can figure out a way of making sure we continue to support our staff members through those.
Thank you. Sylvia.
Can I elaborate a little bit on that too?
Yeah, sure.
Just to say that in our particular case, we already had a flexible work policy and a remote work policy. So when I mentioned before that we created this pandemic plan and we said, okay, this, whatever is in this plan, you know, supersedes anything that is in any other policy, is simply to acknowledge the fact, and this is what we need to always go back to saying, that people are at home trying to work through a pandemic. So that's the mindset that we always go back to thinking every time that we have a question around policies. So we want to make sure that people understand that we're there, much as what Wayne said, to support them. But communication is key. So if anybody has childcare issues, if anybody has a sick relative, I mean, members of our community that has been vastly affected by this pandemic, knowing that they have relatives or partners who may be first line workers and that they are being affected. I mean, there is a psychological element and there is the actual physical element of being in confinement. So I think that we all need to be sensitive to that fact and just simply work on an outcome-based mode through this process, because it's really not so much neither. You can check neither it's suitable to say that people have to be in or out from their homes, checking in or out. This is about the work that they're doing and how we can set them up for success given the current circumstances. This is like our internal perspective of how we're managing our people.
And the next question was also for you, Sylvia. They didn't hear the two tools that you mentioned that you guys use.
Well, we use, for our work, we use Microsoft Office 365. That's what we have in systems, and we also use Ring Central. So for example, we know that Microsoft Office comes with, Microsoft 365 comes with Teams, for example. But that was an app that we had not used before. Instead, we had been using Ring Central because back in the day, we switched our phones there, and then they added the video, and now they added the instant message. People are comfortable with that technology, and we realize now it is not the time to innovate on anything. We're going to be using what we have. We're going to strengthen what we have. So those are the two technologies that all of our staff uses across the board. In addition to that, different departments have other type of technologies. So for example, our applicant tracking system, for example, for standard organizational jobs, right now is also being used for accepting applications for some of our programmatic work. For example, we're using technology that's utilized for a reason that is adaptable and usable. So then we're transferring also to other areas of the organization. So there's other programmatic specific tools for every department that every department has, but overall as an organization are the two ones that I mentioned.
Thank you. The next question is for Frank. Can you say more about the advantage of a board portal over Google Drive? They're saying their team likes Google Drive and they anticipate them not wanting to adopt a new tool when Google Drive seems sufficient.
So the number one, I'd say two things that come to mind right away. Security, a board portal, whether it's our portal or anyone else's portal, is going to be more secure than Google Drive. And there's evidence about some of the ways that Google Drive can be hacked. I see Wayne shaking his head before. He could probably add to that. Secondly, a Google Drive, if you don't have a rigid or an organized administrator or administrators, Google Drive can be kind of very all over the place, whereas a portal is going to make it easier to find what you need to find quicker. It's just lends itself to a more intuitive, easy to follow application. So ease of use, I think, is very much an advantage over Google Drive. Those are two that come to mind, and those are the two that come to mind. I could go on, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Frank. I know for us, we moved from Google to Office 365 because a lot of the technology, the security challenges with Google. I know that there are some state or agencies that don't even want you using Google for certain things because of some technology issues. And as far as board portals go, I mean, I completely agree with what Frank said. We moved from having a shared drive in like Google, a Google Drive, to we now use a SharePoint site for our board, and we use Secure because we have accounts in Office 365 for our board, and they have to actually log in to get it. And this way, as opposed to a shared drive where you might share a link, and then if they leave, you can't take that share back sometimes. In this case, we just disable their account, and this way they're disabled. So next question. What technology? Oh, go ahead, Sylvia.
No, come on, I just wanted to, and I don't know if this is going to actually come on a question, but I didn't mention this when I answered about the technology that we use. But given that I did speak about security and data security, and I should say I'm not necessarily promoting anything in particular. I have no vested interest in what I'm going to say right now, but I find it it has been an amazing tool for us. The name of it is Know Before, Know B number 4 at the end, and you can do compliance and security training through it. So that's the way that we do our data security training, anti-phishing, how to be a firewall, human firewall, etc. And we also do other state compliance, sexual harassment for managers, for employees, etc. So it's all remote. You can set it up in the back end in a way that you have all of the logs for record keeping, etc. So that's a great tool to use, particularly now where like the clock doesn't stop on the compliance that we need to do internally as an organization, and by being remote, that actually has worked wonders for us.
Yeah, we use Know Before also, and it really is a great tool. I mean, I always say that, you know, no matter what great technology we put in place and what security we put in place, the people are the weakest link. And to give them the good training and the way that you're able to put, you know, tests to test them and their ability and see if they get better over time is really helpful.
Yeah.
The next question we have is, what technology are you using for mass communication? We need to avoid email because our clients and community are not on email often. We're using, it's called School Messenger. I had mentioned earlier that it was a system that we had gotten for our school to be able to announce school closings, attendance, stuff like that. We're now using it for the entire agency to send out blasts as well. The great thing is you can use it to make phone calls, send text messages, and send emails, all three. So parts of our organization is using it to communicate with clients, and then our executive director is using it to send out important messages to staff, and it's been very helpful because they get it as a phone call, a text message, and an email. So this way you make sure that they get it. Because a lot of times our direct service workers, you know, they may not necessarily be able to see email, you know, right away because they're busy working, they're not near a computer. So it's very helpful. Are any of you guys using any mass communication things that you find useful? No? Okay. Says, curious, are there examples on policies and procedures regarding telehealth, thinking about the HIPAA issues? What info can be shared?
I don't have anything to add.
I'm sorry, Thomas, I was answering something on the chat. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, it says, are there examples on policies and procedures regarding telehealth, thinking about the HIPAA issues? What info can be shared?
There is a basic disclosure, basically, that no, and this is something that you need to write within your policy, and we have it also described within the pandemic plan that we have. It is that only HR can ask health-related questions, and only if employees are visibly exhibiting symptoms. So as an organization, for example, you might be able to ask employees to, without disclosing a condition, to say if they would fall within a category of risk, for example, if you need that information to create a plan. But you cannot ask, obviously, for that information. And only when somebody is exhibiting symptoms is that only HR can ask if those symptoms potentially can be related to COVID, and in which case, and in that case, if there's the need to inquire, also only HR has the ability to actually tell the person that it's best for the person to go home. Obviously, there needs to be a preemptive policy, as I'm sure that you all have, that anybody who feels sick in any way, shape, form, or capacity, they just simply need to stay home.
Okay, and the last question is, given the emphasis on virtual and the question, how do you educate staff on the importance of documentation?
I feel like it's one of those reminders that we just have to do. I don't know if there's a policy or if there's a best practice. I think part of it is in us having raised money from relief grants, as well as some other, you know, FEMA monies, PPP, like all that stuff going on. I think that we all know at some point the auditors are going to come and they're going to want to make sure things are clean. And that's something my board, as well as my audit committee chair, as well as myself and the leadership team and fiscal, especially with our CFO, continue, and our compliance officers internally continue to hammer home is everyone needs to have all their documentation. Even if we're doing Adobe to sign invoices and checks and contracts remotely, even if we're doing banking deposits in a different way, at the end of the day, we're going to need all that documentation to come back, and not all of it can be remote. Not all of it's just e-files. We're going to need, unfortunately, we're going to have to get some hard copies all back together in one place. That's going to be important, especially for audits.
Quickly to add on to what Wayne said, I mean, evidently there are areas of compliance that there needs to be a record keeping both in HR and in finance, and those in those departments should be doing it in the best capacity through this time, because there's a timeliness to those that need to be in place. In respect to other type of work, it really is an organizational culture element, and it needs to come from the top as to what type of documentation you're requiring people to keep from the programmatic work that they do. What type of documents do they leave behind? And this, I mean, it gets it is more important, relevant now that we're in time in pandemic, but really this applies across the board, pandemic or not. Really, what are the documentation that you keep as an organization for the programmatic work that you do, particularly in what it implies for business continuity, right? Like what somebody leaves, somebody else comes, are they reinventing the wheel because there's no documentation in place as to what was done and how it was done? So that is the part of the organizational culture, but the compliance is something that has to continue. And you need to think about in which ways you're providing people with the resources. Like, for example, we have held internally training sessions in terms of how to sign documents remotely, how to attach the receipts to a particular report, etc. Like, to make sure that there's not like an unsurmountable, like a mountain of work coming back from the fiscal department to deal with, but to try to keep a flow of documentation in place.
Thank you. I think that's it on all the questions we have. Anybody have any other comments? All right, Kay?
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, all our panelists for joining and discussing this interesting topic. Given that a lot of our audience members seem very interested in being able to make sure they can look back on all these resources, just a reminder that a copy of this conference will be available online after the fact, and it should also be emailed out to everyone if you've signed up for the event. In addition, if you're interested in looking at past webinars, those are also on our website and our events page. And if you're interested in checking out other events, even from other organizations or nonprofits, I have to plug my own newsletter called NYN First Read. You can sign up on our website. We have an events page that will show you everything from a week out, you know, any information that might be of interest to your organization. And before we move into the next panel, please feel free to take a quick break, get some water, go to the bathroom. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. I'd like to remind everyone about all the different Zoom functions available to make sure you can take full advantage if you're interested in communicating with panelists or other attendees. Towards the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button, which everyone has been pretty good about using. Please submit your questions there. Moderators will take a look over there in case there's you know, any questions to address. Also, if you're interested in adding other comments just in general, you can feel free to use the chat, which is also at the bottom of the screen. You can also feel free to change the view settings if that's of interest. That's in the top right corner of your screen. Thank you again to our sponsors as well. Cushman & Wakefield, the Parkside Group, Hamerang, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide, Nonprofit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting, your part-time controller, NFP Advisors, and St. Joseph's College, New York. I'd also like to point out that we have a couple of other events coming up with City and State New York. On July 23rd, we'll have a Digital New York event, and registration for that is free and available on our City and State website, which will be linked in the chat. Also on August 4th, we'll have an Economic and Social Equity in New York virtual event, which, just like the Nonprofit OpCon, will run from 1 to 4 p.m. Registration is also free for that event and also on our website. Also, please feel free to check out our partner Be Social Change for their Nonprofit Connector event, which is today at 6 p.m. Just to pursue any other networking opportunities in advance. With that, I will introduce our third panel, Nonprofit Efficiency, Managing Risk, Overhead, and Failure Amid COVID-19. The panelists for this upcoming session, Kim Vackery, the president of NFPadvisorsLLC.com, will be moderating. Also participating in the discussion are Nancy Miller, executive director and CEO of Vision Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired, Brian S. Young, Chief of Operations and Organization Sustainability at Community Change, and Matthew Kirkpatrick, the Vice President of Business Development at Paymerang. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I commend all of you for being here today. I realize we are the last panel of a 2-day Zoom conference, and it's not as easy as it seems to keep people interested during a 2 days of Zoom, but we promise to try to make this panel as informative and interesting as possible and wind up this amazing panel with a bang. As Kay said, we have Nancy Miller joining me today. Nancy, again, is the Executive Director of Visions, the Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired. Brian Young is Chief Operating Officer and Financial Officer for Financial Change. And Matthew Kirkpatrick is VP of Business Development for Paymerang, which is an e-payable solution company. So as I said, this is the last panel of this conference. Those of you that have been here for the last 2 days have heard from some amazing panelists offering their insight as to how they're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, how they're planning for reopening. And we've learned about financial management, how to get our boards more engaged. We've heard about technology. We've heard about office space. And we're going to focus this panel in particular on risk. Even with all of the expertise and all of the experience, risk is something that is unavoidable. Even the strongest and the most prepared nonprofits suffered some type of systematic failure during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can work hard to mitigate risk, but there are some, like a pandemic, that nobody could have been adequately prepared for. Even with the best planning techniques, proper risk assessments, mitigation efforts, nobody could have been prepared for a scenario where basically the country shuts down overnight. And for nonprofits, this meant dealing with canceled fundraising efforts, which is financial risk, loss of service-based revenue, which is financial risk, loss of staff, operational risk, internal control risk, transitioning to remote operations, cyber risk, legal risk, internal control risk, shutting your doors, maybe even closing forever, reputational risk, staff getting sick, legal risk, and the new risk that everybody is going to be faced with is resumption risk. I mean, what are the new risks that we're going to face when we open up again with a lot of unknowns out there? And it's hard to say if stronger risk management practices would have helped. I mean, not many not-for-profits planned for a pandemic, for-profit companies for that matter either. So what we can do best now to help our organization is to learn from what failed, put in new procedures, put in new mitigation efforts, understand what the risks are, and just put ourselves in a better position for moving forward. What we're going to try to do here in this panel is outline a little bit about what worked, what failed, why did it fail, and what we can do to make sure that we're protected for when it happens again. So I'm going to start by opening it up to the panel for some real life experience. And I'm going to start with you, Ryan. How is your organization impacted by the COVID-19 crisis in general? What worked well for you? What didn't work well? And what are you doing to plan for the future?
Thanks, Kim. I guess I start answering this question by actually going back to the last big event to really impact our organization in a way similar to the pandemic, which was the Great Recession. So following the Great Recession, my organization took a really serious view of risk planning and management and really embedding that into our operating culture. For us, it was critical to our ongoing sustainability to have risk management, risk mitigation as an element of our overall culture, and something that was understood and shared by everyone on staff. So one of the ways we developed and really strengthened that risk management culture was through scenario planning. And we've used scenario planning for a number of different issues that have come our way or potentially may come our way. And everything from program delivery issues to financial sustainability, where we really took all kinds of possible situations and worked through both the implications and the action steps for each one of those. So I raised that because an example of what we've done is all the way back in January of 2019, we began scenario planning around a normal recession and the likely impact that would have on our organization, which at the time we assumed was a year or two off. And so we had at the ready a set of action steps that we were prepared to go with. We never could have imagined what 2020 had in store for us, but it did provide us with a really solid starting point for how to begin to really build off of those situations to move into a remote operating posture within the pandemic. Like most organizations, we've experienced direct impact of COVID-19 through our staffing, impact to our goals for the year, impact to our programs. First an initial shock and disruption of moving to that remote state, for stopping travel, canceling programs, a number of events that we had for the spring, and then adjusting and beginning to settle in. We've had to completely revisit, reassess all of our goals, the plans that we had for the year, and make sure that we had both the capacity to fulfill what we were planning to do, but also that it was relevant in this new era that we were finding ourselves in, which has resulted in our program delivery very quickly changing in a significant way to kind of a much more digital presence. So as we look forward to the future, I see us really needing to plan for a working world that is very different than the one that we were in January, and certainly an understanding that we will continue to operate in a very volatile and uncertain world, and be able to refine our planning and our operating norms to meet that by investing in data and technology systems, by looking at our operating processes to make sure that they are really capable of being accomplished, whether we're remote or however we may be having to work for the long term. And then really building out our staff and supervisors' skill and resilience to really thrive in what will be the much more uncertain world that we're going to be inhabiting.
Right. And Nancy, I'm going to ask you the same question. And for you, everything that was thrown at all of us is heightened by the fact of the population that you serve, which made your job, I'm sure, 10 times more difficult than anybody else's. So if you can talk a little bit about how you were impacted, what worked, what didn't, and how you're planning for the future.
Sure, thank you. So Visions is 94 years old, and I've been the executive director, CEO for 32 years. So we've seen many disasters, but this was a disaster that, in fact, things that we had planned for in the past just didn't work. For example, we're very careful about our insurance coverage, but COVID-19 is not covered for business interruption insurance, which we were able to use during Hurricane Sandy and many other disasters. So that coverage already meant that financially there was a risk that we had not planned for. I did work really hard over the last 10 years to create an executive staff team and to work with the board so that the board and the executive team are extremely diverse. not only race and ethnicity, but also their personal and professional backgrounds so that we could complement each other for any disaster that would come up. So somebody with really good tech background, good finance people, good operations. And that was the part that worked. The fact that there were unanticipated issues that we had to resolve, but we had a very good team of people who actually were able to respond. Because our staff and the participants that we serve are blind, when we shifted to remote, first of all, we had to make sure that all our blind staff had the accessible software and all the proper technology at home in order to be able to work at home. Many have smartphones that have applications, but they weren't necessarily going to enable them to do 100% of their work. And so we had to send computers with all the accessible software to staff at home and make sure that our blind staff were able to work as efficiently as the other staff. In terms of our participants, excuse me, we serve about 7,000 people a year. And the younger population does have technology at home, mostly because they've gotten it through the school system or in preparation for college. But more than half the people we serve are older blind people, and they do not have the technology. They were not born blind. They've had acquired vision loss, and often they don't even know how to use the accessibility features on their smartphones. So the first couple of weeks when we pivoted and we closed, we were doing a lot of training, even to the point of people who are still using landline phones and have no other technology. How are we going to communicate? So we bought people cradles for their phones so they could put it down so they can follow instructions that we might be able to give and they can listen to it. We had to adapt with many different ways of communicating. So of course, everybody is using Zoom, but we're using FaceTime, we're using WhatsApp, anything that the person's familiar with, that's the format that we'll be willing to use. But it meant that my instructors had to know how to use them as well. So we had to quickly train ourselves to be able to use all the technology that was really needed. In terms of disaster planning, we have a very good disaster plan, and it doesn't sit on a shelf, something that we review constantly, but there were things that we just didn't really prepare for, like the safety plans that the state is requiring are so detailed and so specific to COVID that we always had a plan for if we had to close one office space, we have 3 locations, how we would work out of the other 2. But in this case, all 3 offices were closed, and we had to then adapt to what if we have to stay remote for a much longer period of time. So you could say it was a failure, but it was more the magnitude of the closures and now our preparations for reopening that really have to include very special preparations, because some of the instructors that go into the homes of blind participants to do our training are blind themselves. So if you're a blind person, you really depend on a lot of touch. How are you going to provide that kind of training when you're supposed to be 6 feet away? So we've come up with all new protocols of how to both keep the staff safe and how to keep the participants safe. We've also had to create different questionnaires, in order for people to come back to the office, different waivers. Even though I know many lawyers say that waivers are not going to protect you from a lawsuit, they do deter. And we want to make sure that people are at least aware that there's a risk of somebody coming into their home, and what are we doing in order to protect them? So besides the regular PPEs, we've gotten rolling bags for our staff that go from home to home with chucks in them. Those are covers that you can put on a table or a couch so that you're not infecting somebody else. And when you leave, you can take it and throw it away, so everything is disposable. The good news is we operate a senior center that closed, but we're now offering 50 virtual classes a week that over 350 blind older people are participating in one form or another. So I think we've been extremely inventive. And I think in previous panels today, people have talked about some of the positives that have come out of COVID-19. And I think some of our managing the risk as it's happening has also enabled us to create efficiencies or create effectiveness in ways that we didn't before.
Yeah, and I would say that, but it sounds like the both of you, your nonprofits, did very well in the risk assessment area prior to this. A lot of nonprofits haven't done a full-fledged risk assessment, haven't identified, what all the risks are, and haven't identified what the various mitigation efforts are. And as we go forward, we just keep adding more and more risk, particularly with the legal risk of bringing employees back and them getting sick. So it just adds another whole layer of risk that I would say all organizations really need to be aware of. And there's a very simple tool that I use for a bunch of my clients that's, just a questionnaire so you can identify what your risks are. And then there's a corresponding set of mitigation efforts. And it's just to check a box. Do you have these in place? And I would urge everybody to do that, as soon as you can, because the risks just keep getting added on to the ones that we normally face. And I think the resumption risk and the legal unknown there is really going to be a risk for not-for-profits going forward. So Matthew, your company is an e-payable company. You work with a lot of nonprofits. How can nonprofits adjust their internal operations, their financial operations to become more streamlined, efficient, and somehow better manage their risks going forward? Can't hear you. Can't hear you, Matthew. Well, we'll let I think something you have to turn your volume up, but maybe we'll just skip to another question.
Tim, I think somebody was on. Yeah, I think I was somebody from New York media just on mute.
Okay, did you hear my question?
I did hear the question.
Okay, great.
And yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, just real quick, one of our proudest moments really of this whole thing is we were able to go remote within a couple of weeks. The whole company, that is. And what we were proud about is we were able to continue to provide the same level of service during this COVID time as we were before. The fact that we help nonprofits go remote with their accounts payable, it was important for us to keep those same standards and go remote ourselves. With regards to the risk, when it comes to the accounts payable process, payment fraud is at an all-time high. So you've got to make sure that you're managing this risk properly. I mean, the fraudsters out there are using new tools and savvy schemes all the time to infiltrate electronic payments. So it's important that you have correct risk management best practices around these business payments to help you mitigate the chance of fraud. Obviously, checks are the least secure payment method. But the thing is, what people don't realize, just because you're using a provider to do your payments electronically, it still comes with risk. ACH fraud is at an all-time peak and shows no sign of slowing down. And then BEC, which is business email compromise, those attacks have resulted in much higher levels of wire fraud. So there's a sobering stat actually from the Association of Finance Professionals in their payment fraud survey. 78% of all organizations experienced attempted or actual payment fraud in 2017. So 78% is a large area, you know, large number of organizations right there. Most of the losses can be attributed to, you know, outside fraudsters via forged checks, stolen cards, BEC schemes, like I just said. So you just got to make sure you've got some best practices in place. Some of those best practices are what we make sure our clients have. And what we've seen actually, the demand for our services has gone up during COVID because of the need to go remote. So it's been an interesting time trying to meet that demand, but obviously it's a good problem to have. You've got to make sure you're using positive pay on all your checks. That's not new, but it's effective, and you'd be surprised how many people don't have it in place. You've got to make sure you manage your vendor banking information. Obviously, that's a target for fraudsters, so you've got to make sure your solutions provider has a multi-layered approach to gathering, verifying, storing, and updating that information. Make sure you're using an FBO account, which is a for benefit of account. Why is this important? FBO accounts are especially designed to handle funds intended to go to another party. And just make sure you've got certain controls in place in your AP. Predefined system permissions and privileges, separations of duties, administrative controls for security settings. So all different things you need to make sure you have in place. A big one is making sure you have a plan to keep your and your vendors' sensitive data out of harm's way. So you've got to make sure you've got two-factor authentication, enables organizations to restrict system access. And really, our job as a e-payable provider is to shield your information from being out there in the public sphere, and we do that in quite a few different ways. And I think Nancy mentioned insurance. Make sure you've got the right insurance when it comes to your payments, not just the cheapest. Make sure you get the correct insurance. So I think those, along with having you pay your suppliers with virtual cards, that's the most secure method of payment, and making sure you're not having to do all the burdensome follow-up work on reconciling your payments. Let your provider do that and do all that on your behalf. So they're definitely some of the ways that we've been managing risk for our clients when it comes to the business payments on the AP side.
Yes, I think nonprofits that had these types of systems in place probably were in a much better position. But the problem with the COVID-19 crisis is there wasn't a lot of warning before all of a sudden people had to work from home. And so if you're all of a sudden in that position, how do you get bills paid? Where is the check stock being kept? Who is signing off on the checks? And if all of a sudden you have to work on that remotely without supervision, all of your checks and balance and all of your internal controls sort of fly out the window if you're not on an e-payable system. So for those nonprofits that were not on an e-payable system, I would recommend that they review the processes and the policies and the procedures and the internal controls that are in place now for remote working, and make sure that they're still holding. Make sure that somebody is overseeing signing of checks. Make sure that the same person is not opening the bill and paying the bill or collecting the cash. Whatever internal controls you had in the office must be able to be carried over into the remote office environment. And for this question is for Nancy and for Ryan. How did you deal with that? Because as I said, there wasn't a lot of warning as to, you know, all of a sudden you had to be remote. How did you continue your financial operations? And how did you address the added new cyber risk that is added on top of that?
Yeah, I can address the, you know, how did we manage paying bills and checks? Fortunately, we had one member of our administrative team who lives within walking distance of our office. So he was actually going into the office, collecting mail, taking pictures with his iPhone of everything that came in, and then sending it to me as the CEO, our CFO, and our COO. So we were able to track every check. He did the same thing with every bill. So even though we were not in the office, we had one person who actually was making sure that the mail was being handled. I'm actually sheltering in place in New Jersey. So I had payroll sent to me where I'm sheltered, and I signed the payroll. We have only 3 checks that are actually direct deposit. The other checks are all, we basically give out stubs. So I just made sure that everybody who was on that payroll was actually an employee of the staff, which is our check and balance. We do have 3 locations, 2 that we own and 1 that we lease. And one of our own locations is in Rockland County with 37 acres. So I actually met our CFO at that location because we had plenty of social distancing, and I was able to sign checks for bills that we couldn't do electronically or that were not in our system. But we thought this through very carefully to make sure there was still the separation of duties, so that we didn't have somebody signing checks that really was never authorized to do it in the first place. We just changed our procedures. One other good thing is that we have a very active board, and our assistant treasurer lives very close to where our CFO lives. So for double signature checks where there needed to be a board approval, there was an actual person who could double sign a check that I had signed. So all of our fiscal policy procedures, we actually were able to adhere to, even
Right.
though we were doing it from various locations or things were being sent to different addresses. We were very careful to maintain the fiscal policies that we had.
Right.
How about you, Ryan?
So on the fiscal policies, we've been able to maintain continuity without issue. Really was a seamless transition for us because we were on an e-pay system and had been for a while. And so even those individuals who wanted to receive hard copy checks, we still were able to provide that through the e-pay system. So I do highly recommend if any of the organizations out there watching have not considered an e-pay system, it really did make the transition for our financial team so much easier. To your question about the cyber risk side, the week that we decided that we were going to go remote, we began a series of conversations with our managed services provider. So most of our technology is managed outside of the organization, to make sure that they were aware of what we were doing and that all of the the security protocols were in place for us to move remote. And one of the first things that we did was to actually test our staff. And on the earlier panel, one of the panelists had noted KnowBe4, which is a great product, and we use it, and I highly recommend as well, because we were able to, the very first week that our staff were out and working remote, we issued a series of tests, and we were able to see where the vulnerabilities were within different teams, because we figured there was so much disruption. That was the perfect opportunity to really test how strong our systems were. And so I think using services like that to constantly be checking on just how strong are the staff as it relates to cybersecurity protocols is a really important one to take.
And I think this is probably for you, Matthew. I would assume that there's a lot of nonprofits out there that are hesitant to move to an e-payable system for many reasons. The cost maybe, but also the security and the training of the staff. How can you? What are some of the security controls that you have in place for your product or any other e-payable system that would allay their fears, but also be more efficient?
Yeah. A couple of things. We've been able to automate folks' AP process with our e-payable solution, and really we're able to do through three main benefits. It's the security, efficiency, and profitability, all for zero cost. So not all e-payable solutions are the same. So you really need to do your research and look into things. On the security piece, we take all the liability and responsibility of making your payments. So we help our clients become more secure by providing world-class fraud protection through various security controls that you pertain to in the question. So some of them are, we use pre-funded virtual cards. So they're single use, they're not actual plastic cards. They go away after you use them. They're not actual physical plastic cards. We don't write down or enter any ACH details. Our clients' account and routing numbers are not on their checks. So there's all these different ones, security controls, where we make sure we're shielding our clients' sensitive info from being out in the public sphere, because obviously fraud is exploding. So, we're PCI compliant, we're NACHA compliant, we're OFAC compliant. So we have numerous security controls that we take care of. That, to be honest, a lot of folks don't even think about. On the OFAC, I'm not sure people are aware of what OFAC is, but it's basically a federal do not pay list. And any companies, it's from the US government, any companies involved in money laundering or terrorist activities are on this list. So in the background, we do weekly cross-references of those lists with vendors, make sure you're not inadvertently paying them or someone connected to them. And you would never know. So we just want to make sure people's ducks are in a row, because minimum fines start at 500,000, plus it's a reputation killer. We're also a SOC 2 audited firm, so you have access to all our reports. And then I think the big piece is the efficiency gains as well. What we're able to do is maximize work from home capabilities. Not everybody lives close to the office or the CFO in Nancy's situation, so you need to have a plan in place so they can pay bills from anywhere with total remote access. So it gives them a lot of flexibility, yet they still have 100% control of who to pay and when to pay. You control all that. We've been able to lighten their load and streamline their whole process. So they don't have to write or print stuff and mail checks anymore. So it really reduces paper and eliminates those manual processes. So we do create a paperless workflow. So we do save our clients time and money. And then with the time savings, what it does is for nonprofits, it frees up the staff to do more strategic tasks, which better support the mission. So it's not just simply about paying the vendors the way they want to be paid and paying them quickly. It's the fact that we do all the follow-up, all the heavy lifting associated with AP. So essentially, you get a team of specialists who become an extension of your AP team. And what we found is, because of the expertise of our team, it reduces the amount of calls you get about disputes and unclaimed funds. And one thing I want to add too, Kim, is the thing is, a lot of people associate outsourcing with additional expense and less control. Our solution is zero cost, so we save clients money, and on top of that, we make sure you have full control, and then we create a quarterly revenue stream. So it's like a nice little bonus. And because of our relationships with Visa, we share the interchange profits with our clients. So our clients do it for security reasons, and they do it for efficiency gains. And then the icing, or the cherry on top of the ice cream sundae, so to speak, is we're able to provide some revenue every quarter, and there's no cost to it. So it's a bit of a win-win situation, and that's not the case for all e-payable solutions.
So another question for both Nancy and for Ryan. We are seeing New York City start to reopen. We're in phase 2, soon to be in phase 3. We've heard throughout this conference, some people are bringing people back, some people are not bringing them back until after Labor Day, when we have more information. What have each of you been doing to plan for reopening, plan for resurgence, which everybody is talking about, that there's going to be another resurgence in the fall, and how are you addressing the added risk that both of those things bring on?
So I can start. We've actually been planning our reopening since we went remote you know, we knew at some point staff would be coming back to the office. We have 106 staff. None of our staff were laid off or furloughed or had salary reduction. So we had to make sure that they were able to do their jobs remotely. And if the particular program they were working on was closed, for example, our senior center, what tasks could they do that would still support those blind participants? So we've changed everybody's job description to make it clear whether or not and which tasks can be done remotely and which can't. So that was the first thing. Second thing was coming up with a questionnaire that every staff person that is leaving their remote location to either come to our office or to go into the home of any of our participants, we worked with our legal counsel to come up with a questionnaire. I think typical of what all nonprofits are working on right now, we're having staff take their own temperature at home and complete this questionnaire. And if the answers to the questions are no, then they can come to work. If the answer to any question is yes, then they get instructions. So if they say, yes, I've been exposed to COVID within the last 14 days, don't come into the office, work remotely. So it's a list of the typical questions. I think there are some good questionnaires that you can get over the internet, but we wanted to work directly with an attorney to make sure that we were asking the questions properly, both for the safety of the staff person, but also for the safety of the agency. And then we also created a questionnaire for every one of our participants to make sure that they felt comfortable having our staff come into the home, but that they would answer the questions, no, they've not been exposed, no, they have no symptoms, that our staff would be safe going into the home. So it was both from the staff and the participant side. The other thing we've done, we've told the staff that when they go from client home to client home, we will pay for Uber, Lyft, City Bike, whatever they need so that it minimizes the amount of time they have to be on public transportation. That seems to be the biggest concern since we're serving every neighborhood of New York City, all of Long Island, Westchester, and Rockland County. People are very worried about public transit. So they may need to use it to commute, but any other travel they're doing during the day, we're trying to give them a safer, less risky way, and we're paying for that. And then of course, all of the PPE, the cleaning and the sanitizing, we've had to purchase items that a blind staff person can easily use. So there are these foot operated sanitizers, but we had to make sure that a blind person would know where to put their foot. We're required to have arrows on the floor in our office. Our blind staff is not going to be able to see that. So we have to come up with other tactile markings that make it possible for them to know the flow of the walkway, and also just to ask if somebody's in the hallway in a certain area, because they won't be able to see that they're there.
Wow.
Wow, it's amazing.
Your job has a whole new level of complexity than any of the other not-for-profits we have. Ryan, how about you?
So we are a national organization, and so we've had the challenge of how to make sure we were keeping everyone safe with people in about 45 of the states. So we've had to take a bit of a national perspective in terms of how we've managed this. We closed early and expect that we will remain in remote status with the office closed, no travel, no in-person convening long past the official phasing requirements, and really are working with the prospect that we may be remote for the next year or more as we wait for a vaccine. We, like Nancy, have certainly tried to take all of the steps we could for when staff did need to go into the office for one reason or another. And so public transportation, I think, was one of our top concerns as well. And so making sure that staff knew that they could be reimbursed for an Uber ride in to the office as opposed to taking public transportation, so that we could do everything we possible to keep people as safe as we could, as well as making sure that the office had PPE there on site for people to use if needed. We're really beginning our exploration of what the return looks like and how to manage through the resurgence beyond the expectation of just continued remote work. But as we think about our office, we actually are working with a building engineering firm and architect to help us reimagine what the future of our space will look like, expecting both short and long-term work change considerations. And it's an overwhelming number of issues and lots and lots of opinions and conflicting data. And so for us, it was important that we're really grounding that in some expert guidance, and along with that, making sure that we were really surveying our staff and understanding what their concerns were, what their expectations and needs would be as we even considered a return to physical proximity with each other.
Can I add something real quick?
Yeah. I just want to add one other thing, that Cushman and Wakefield actually has an excellent opening product that we've used. But also the idea that because we have 3 locations, we're opening them at different times. And I think those organizations really have to look at each individual situation to determine when the right time is, regardless of what the pause says. You may need to open later in order to be better prepared to manage the risks of your particular location.
Yeah.
Matthew?
And Kim, can I add something just
Sure.
real quick? I mean, just taking a step back for regards to like the future or even now in the future, I think it's important, nonprofits and all organizations kind of go through their operating processes for each department and look for these inefficiencies. So look for anything that takes a long time, requires a lot of paper, a lot of manual labor. See which areas you can automate, go electronic. What could you do in-house better? What can you outsource? And I think also empower staff. I mean, I think we've asked a lot of our staff questions and kind of for them to highlight inefficiencies because they're the ones doing the job. And I think sometimes you get the best creative ideas and solutions from your staff. You just need to empower them and kind of get them part of the process. And certainly ask them why they're doing things a certain way. And if you keep getting the answer trial and error, or that's the way it's always been done, you may need to consider changing some procedures.
The other thing I would add, and I work with lots of nonprofits, my firm caters to small nonprofits to do just this, do assessments to make sure that they are set up efficiently, that they have proper risk assessments are done, financial assessments are done. And I know a lot of nonprofits are struggling financially right now, but now is really the time to do these types of assessments, do a risk assessment, do a financial assessment, find out where your risks are, document all of your processes. Make sure the staff is trained, make sure that there's succession and backup, and take the time now to make sure that what was missing is in place. It's worth every penny, it's worth every moment of time, because it's what will allow you to survive in the future. And one other thing, we talked a lot about things that you're doing to mitigate the new risks. the risk of COVID, the risks of staff getting sick. Risk management is, a lot of layers.
Yeah.
If you put in mitigation techniques to address those risks, then you have financial risk. We've heard a lot about cash flow problems that not-for-profits had, but all of these mitigation efforts for the new risks cost money. You need to reconfigure your offices, you need to pay for transportation, you need new equipment, you need new technology. How are you both dealing with that, both Nancy and Ryan?
Ryan, why don't you go first?
Okay. So, I started by talking about the Great Recession, and I think that was, for us, was this great learning moment about the financial risk preparations. And so at that, learning from that experience, we began building reserves, which we did not have prior to the recession. And, month by month, we made our deposits. We budgeted annually for reserve building, and having that cushion has been incredibly important to us to manage liquidity now, and of course as we go forward in continued uncertainty. So I think that has been one of the best things that we've done. The other is that in good times we negotiated a line of credit with our bank so that we could have that in place as well, and to make sure that we've got a couple of tools in our financial management toolbox.
That's great.
Yeah, I would add, first of all, I spoke directly with the board. Just as this was occurring, we were about to work on updating our strategic plan, and we basically put that on hold and said, we really, with the pandemic, that's a long-range plan, but we need to deal with short-term issues right now. We also have reserves, so I wanted to make sure that the board would be willing to spend them if we needed them to cover the overhead costs that we couldn't get covered any other way. We did apply for and get the PPP loan, which was helpful in terms of staffing, but it did not cover the technology and all the other expenses. So we went to other foundations that have funded us in the past. We did get funded through the New York Community Trust, which was a consortium of foundations to help cover COVID-related expenses. We also were part of coalitions that did some very effective advocacy. The Human Services Council, Live On New York, Nonprofit New York, Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, UJA, and our government contract now, we just learned, is going to give us a quick advance. So where they've always given us some advance on our contract, this one is going to come in even earlier than normal. As long as the contract is registered, we'll be able to get the advance. So that kind of group advocacy has been helpful in cash flow situations. I think also looking for where you can get free or bartered service. The city actually is providing some free PPEs. So we've been able to get it through the Department for the Aging. We've been able to get it through the Office of Emergency Management. In Rockland County, where we serve people, the United Way is providing PPEs. So looking for other sources of either free or being able to cover those services. I think also going directly to the board for specific needs that nobody else is picking up, and letting them know that what we need now is a general donation, not something that is specific and restricted. And if you can get your board to give those general donations, then you can go to your donor base and say, look, the board has come up with XYZ. We're now looking to you to help us for what are really government unfunded mandates. We tried to get the state to cover PPEs, and they refuse. So, you know, we have a story to tell that we've done everything we could do. Now we need your help in order to help us. We've done some virtual events. All of our fundraising events were canceled. They're now canceled through September, but my guess is we're going to be canceling everything at least through January. And we've done some smaller virtual events. It's not our expertise, but they've really kept us close to the donor. We have attracted close to 300 new donors through these small events that have brought us to an audience that didn't know us before. And so for me, that's going to be capacity building for the future.
That's fabulous, because one of the financial risks that was thrown at all of the nonprofits during this COVID-19 was the loss of revenue from the loss of fundraising. And it's not an easy thing when you're a small nonprofit that has maybe one gala a year and that raises, you know, 90% of your funds. It's not easy for them to switch automatically over to virtual. So that's a huge financial risk, is how do you keep your donors? Ryan, how have you handled that?
So we're, you know, we're always in relationship, I think, with our donors. And so that really was, I think, central to our strategy, which was to stay really in constant contact with our foundation and individual donors, being really upfront about what the needs were for us as an organization and the communities that we're directly working with. You know, really making that case that this, in fact, as Nancy said, is a time for general funding, and making sure that we had that flexibility in the funding that was coming in. So both kind of sustaining or maintaining the fundraising inflow, but also making sure that you know, it was as flexible as possible as we tried to maneuver this period of time.
Yeah.
So I think we have a little bit of time left. I wanted to ask both of you who are, you know, really living real life experience of running nonprofits, what this COVID-19 pandemic has, how has it made you change how you look at risk management? It seems like both of you were doing a great job before this, which put you in a position, in a much better position than some nonprofits weren't. But how has this changed the way that you look at risk, and what does the future look like for you?
Yeah, I think it's added areas that we might not have looked at as closely as we should have, that we now know that we need to look at closer. For just one example, we have a pool that opens at our facility up in Rockland County. And opening a pool now has risk than it did before. So, you know, we're being very careful. We are going to reopen it, but we're following very, very strict guidelines that we will probably maintain even after a vaccine is discovered. I think looking at the fact that we are probably going to remain a hybrid organization with some staff working remotely and some staff doing in-person work indefinitely. Some of the efficiencies have occurred through remote work, but we also have to look at the risks that causes and making sure that we're protected and that the staff is protected, because we've never had so many of our staff working remotely before. I have to say we had a fabulous staff member that moved to Minneapolis, and we agreed to keep him on staff. So we've actually had a remote employee for many years, but going from 1 to going to 106 was a big lift. But I think looking at the risks of remote workforce requires us to assess that risk differently than we have in the past. I think also looking at the nature of our population, you know, it wasn't just COVID. It's also the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, looking at, are we equitably and fairly making the assignments, offering the opportunities, really talking the talk and walking the walk about giving Black people in our staff and people of color the opportunities that that they are entitled to. So we're looking at our staffing, our promotions, our performance evals, our benefits in a different way, because we're dealing with several different lenses now that we may not have been as aware of before. We've always looked very carefully to make sure that our blind staff have been given the same opportunities, because we do job placements with other employers, and we want to be the example of how you can make sure that blind people have access to promotional opportunities and other things. But now we're looking at it with a much clearer lens around all diversity, that I think is different because of the timing and the learning that we've had to do, especially as a white woman of privilege, being able to better understand how the COVID-19 has affected the Black community, but communities of color, and we serve primarily low-income people. So we've got older people, we've got people who are blind, and we've got low-income participants who are at the greatest risk of this pandemic.
How about you, Ryan?
So we're in a very similar place, and I think you know, this whole experience of 2020 has proven the importance of risk management, risk mitigation, planning for organizations, for nonprofit organizations. You know, I remember on our pre-call, I was talking about you know, having been through so many trainings that talked about the VUCA world, you know, the volatile and uncertain world, and you know, nothing that we've experienced this year even registered as being conceivable as we were doing various exercises in those trainings. And so, you know, that's real, is that we live in this incredibly uncertain time, very volatile time. And so, you know, taking all of the learning that this pandemic has provided us as an organization and applying that forward, and to continue to raise the bar for our risk planning, and continue to raise the bar for the culture of risk management as a normalized activity within an organization, I think is so important as we move forward. And you know, I echo what Nancy was saying, you know, in terms of really paying attention to you know, the number of factors of our staffing. We are a majority person of color organization. We predominantly support you know, organizations around the country that are in communities of color, and COVID obviously has directly impacted communities of color the hardest. And so really using our values as an organization, using our race and gender justice perspectives in the application of our work on a day-to-day, whether that's, you know, from a risk management, a financial management, and in terms of really supporting our staff in a time in which the support of, you know, the whole person and wellness is so critical for all of us.
And Matthew, I can guess what your answer is going to be, but what does the future look like for you in terms of helping nonprofits become more efficient and manage the risk?
I mean, I just think generally people shouldn't be afraid of change, because I think in order to survive and be successful, we're going to have to change different processes. So I think there's a lot of good people and companies out there and experts who know what they're doing. So I implore people to look into these and really try and figure out a way to be more efficient and more secure without it like crushing your budget or without having to make any fundamental changes. The feedback we keep getting, Kim, from our nonprofit is that we're able to work with their current ERP system, so they don't have to make any changes. It's just a matter of integrating with what they've got going on. So I think that's the future, is basically being nimble and being able to pivot and be able to help folks without them having to do a whole lot. One of our clients said to me, and I'm going to leave this as a quote, it said, Paymerang is not a project to implement or a system to change, it's a procedure to execute. So people need to be not afraid of looking into some system changes.
Yeah, and I would just, echo that, if anybody has learned anything from this quick onset of the pandemic is to be prepared, make sure that everything is documented, all of the systems and procedures are documented, you've done a risk assessment, you've done a financial assessment, yeah, and you are prepared, because it's not over. It may be slowing down, but everybody says it's coming back, and we should take this time to really make sure that we're prepared for the future. Yeah. Absolutely. So I don't see any questions in the Q&A. There was one in the chat that I might just read. I think this is probably for you, Matthew. Somebody says, many city and state auditors only want to see canceled checks to back up their OTPS. How soon before that changes for the future? Meaning, I think they're talking about they want hard copy checks for auditing purposes. Have you seen that problem before?
No, I haven't, and we are a SOC 2 audited firm, so what we've realized is accountants love working with us because we have all our ducks in a row, and we can create and we can provide all the documentation that's needed. And I know folks our clients can access images and can get hard copies of checks, because we're still sending checks to people. It's just that we're doing it on your behalf. So there's still that paper trail. It's just that it's on us to manage all that. So we don't have a problem with that. And I can get some more detailed answers if they'd like to email me directly. But we haven't seen any issues with that so far.
Okay. So I see Kay is here, so I assume we're out of time. Thank you all to my fellow panelists, and I hope that all the participants enjoyed this panel. Okay.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our panelists who participated in today's discussions, and thank you again to our attendees as well for joining us in all these conversations. And that marks the end of Nonprofit OpCon, but please keep in mind we'll have plenty of other events coming up. City and State will have a Digital NY event on July 23rd and an Economic and Social Equity in New York virtual event on August 4th. And also, if you have extra time today, we also have a Be Social Change for event called Nonprofit Connector. They're a partner of ours. It's going to be a networking event that is free for all OpCon attendees. If you register with the code Nonprofit100, links to all of these are in the Zoom chat. Thank you again to all of our sponsors, Cushman & Wakefield, the Parkside Group, Paymerang, Citron Cooperman, Incline Pension Consulting, Nationwide, Nonprofit Sector Strategies, Pentagra, Roberta Katz Consulting, your part-time controller, NFP Advisors, and St. Joseph's College, New York. Look forward to seeing you all again at all of our future events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Safe.